Across the old Germanic languages, the common everyday word for the highest divine power is strikingly consistent. Whether you look at Gothic, Old English, Old Saxon, Old Frisian, Old High German, Old Norse, and later Scandinavian forms, you keep meeting the same compact core, a sound shape like God or Gud. That surface unity hides a set of older grammatical quirks that feel like fossils. In several early dialects, the word behaves as masculine in meaning and usage, yet it does not always carry the neat, masculine endings you would expect in the nominative. In Gothic and in Old Norse, for instance, the usual masculine marker you might anticipate at the end is absent, and the Gothic genitive singular is formed in a way that stands out from the regular pattern. Instead of inserting the connecting vowel that most nouns would use, the genitive appears in a tighter, older-looking form, the same sort of clipped genitive found in a small group of irregular kinship words. Old High German shows a similar cluster of irregular genitives for man, father, and brother, and that makes it tempting to suspect that the divine name once had an equally old, short genitive form there too, even if later manuscripts more often show the regularized version. It is easy to imagine why. Speakers tend to protect sacred words from casual reshaping. A form treated as holy can remain unusually conservative, while surrounding vocabulary gets smoothed out by habit. That sense of special status shows up in other ways as well. Names of the divine in these traditions often resist ordinary grammatical accessories. Articles, for example, are commonly avoided with the word in its highest sense, because it is felt as a proper name that does not need to be singled out by a or the. This is not an absolute rule in every context, and there are cases where an article appears when someone is speaking of a pagan god, as one figure among others, almost as if it were a title rather than the unique name of the supreme being. But the overall tendency is clear. The word is treated like something already defined by its very nature. When people try to explain where the word originally came from, certainty becomes much harder. A popular idea is to connect it to the adjective good, because the two sit close together in meaning and are often linked in religious language. Yet the vowels do not match neatly across the oldest forms, and the sound steps required to turn one into the other are not straightforward unless you can demonstrate intermediate grades that are not reliably present for this specific case. It remains true that many cultures call their god the good, and Christian phrasing strongly encouraged that connection. But a pleasing association is not the same thing as an etymology. Another tempting confusion is with ethnic names like Goths or Geats, because they look similar at a glance. But those group names have their own histories and should not be blended into the divine title just because the letters happen to line up. Comparisons beyond the Germanic world have also been suggested. Some scholars have pointed to a resemblance between the Germanic word and a Persian form used for Lord, and they have tried to trace that Persian form back to an older Iranian expression, meaning something like self-created or given by itself. If that long chain were right, it would imply that the Germanic term was once a compound with a powerful meaning, the being that exists by its own nature. Whether or not that specific root convinces you, the idea itself is revealing because it matches a widespread religious instinct. People reach for language that makes the highest power independent, uncaused, beyond ordinary origins. Similar phrases exist in Slavic religious speech as well, where people address God with expressions meaning self-made or self-begotten, as if the best compliment is to deny any external source. Personal names offer another clue, though they rarely solve the puzzle on their own. In early Germanic naming, the divine element appears frequently as a first part in compounds. You find it attached to warrior names, servant names, peace names, and all sorts of honorific combinations. But this only shows that the word carried weight and prestige. It does not force a single, concrete meaning beyond the divine. When the element comes at the end of a compound, the direction can shift. A final God may name not a human, but a divine figure, because the compound then reads like a description of a god, rather than a person dedicated to God. Naming patterns preserve cultural habits, yet they often preserve them without leaving the explanatory label behind. The earliest Christian translations into Germanic languages reveal another layer. The same word can slide in grammatical gender depending on what it is referring to. In certain Gothic texts, when the translators speak of gods in the sense of idols, the forms lean toward a neuter plural, as if false gods are being treated more like objects than persons. Old English shows a similar move. When idols are meant, the plural can behave like a neuter category. It is not that the religion suddenly changed the language's entire gender system. It is more like a subtle, rhetorical choice. The true God is a personal being, addressed and obeyed, while idols are lifeless things, made by hands, and the grammar can be made to hint at that difference. This helps explain another apparent contradiction. Plural forms of the word exist, even though a strict monotheistic view insists the supreme God cannot be plural. The language carries the plural because people often need to talk about other people's gods, about idols, about stories of many divine beings, or about pagan religion in general. A special set of words even grows up to mark false divinity. Compounds meaning false god or idol become common, and again, they often behave as neuter. It is a linguistic way of lowering the status of rival powers. In later German usage, a separate term for idol becomes prominent, and religious writers treat it as the label for a carved figure or a delusion rather than a real being. The words themselves become instruments of theology. Everyday speech, especially in moments of emotion, shows how careful people can be with sacred names. Many communities develop softened exclamations that avoid pronouncing the divine name directly. They change a sound, clip a syllable, or substitute a similar word so that anger and surprise can be expressed without what feels like a violation. You can hear the same impulse across Europe. French alters its divine oaths into euphemistic forms. English does something similar in old oaths, and German dialects historically played the same game by reshaping the first consonant or swapping the vowel. This is not merely superstition, it is a social rule about respect, reinforced by habit until it becomes almost automatic. The divine name also seeps into older greetings and formulas of welcome in ways that can feel surprisingly physical and immediate. In medieval German poetry, a guest is not simply welcomed by the host. The phrase welcomes the newcomer to God and to the speaker, as if both are present in the room and both provide protection. In some regions, a greeting built on God welcome survived in dialect for a very long time, spoken like a warm, everyday formula, rather than a church phrase. The idea behind it is simple. The highest power is everywhere, and hospitality is safer when the guest is placed under that protection. In other Slavic traditions, you hear the same thought expressed directly. God receive you. The farewell answers with its own family of expressions. God guide you, God keep you, God bless you. These are not abstract slogans, they are verbal gestures meant to place a person into a safe space. A related habit appears in statements of certainty and secrecy. Medieval verse often intensifies a claim by pairing the speaker with God. God knows, and I know. Sometimes the phrase becomes almost intimate. No one knows except God and me. It is a way of sealing a statement with the strongest witness imaginable, and it also gives the speaker a strange comfort, because even if the world doubts, God is assumed to understand. Similar formulas exist in Northern storytelling too, where a character says that no one can know a certain secret except himself and the highest God. In the old imagination, secret knowledge is one of the signs of divinity. A god is revealed not by a crown, but by the fact that hidden things are open to him. At the same time, older language does not keep God at a safe emotional distance. Medieval writers freely describe God as pleased, joyful, gentle, or satisfied while creating something beautiful. When poetry praises an exceptional person, it may say that God was in a particularly gracious mood when he made them, as if the maker's emotional state left a signature in the finished work. In the same playful spirit, poems sometimes claim that God himself would like to look at a beautiful woman, or would enjoy hearing a musician, or would have watched an impressive sword stroke with delight. In some passages, the laughter of heavenly beings becomes part of the scene, as if the sky itself reacts the way a human audience would. This is not careful theology. It is storytelling instinct, and it preserves something older than scholastic language. A world where the divine feels close enough to have moods, preferences, and moments of enjoyment. But the other side is just as present. The same tradition speaks of divine anger, vengeance, and wrath with blunt force. People talk as if disasters in harvests, illness, and social collapse are the visible marks of an offended God. Law codes even justify public rules by warning that certain behavior provokes divine anger and brings collective punishment. Poets and storytellers use phrases where God rues something, or where a person is driven into God's hatred. There are formulas of cursing that do not merely wish someone bad luck. They place the person into a hostile relationship with the divine, as if they deserve to be cut off from protection itself. One detail is especially revealing. There exists a parallel curse that replaces God with the sun. To be sent into the sun's hatred is to be denied the sun's kindly light. That is an image with a strong pre-Christian flavour. It suggests an older layer of belief where natural powers, especially the life-giving sun, carried something like moral judgment. Even after the religious framework shifted, the curse survived because it still made perfect emotional sense. A person cast out from the sun's favour is not simply unlucky. They are unworthy of daylight. In moments of crisis, a more rebellious attitude can surface as well, and this too has deep roots. Ancient writers describe peoples who threaten their gods with weapons during storms, as if they could fight the sky. Later, stories repeat similar impulses in a Christian setting. If the divine refuses help, a king threatens to tear down altars and silence churches. In folk practice, failed harvests and bad luck sometimes lead communities to punish a saint's statue by dunking it in water or treating it roughly, as if the sacred figure must be reminded of its duty. Greek tradition even records whipping certain gods' images when hunting went badly. The details change by culture, but the logic is the same. People treat the divine as a power that can be pressured, negotiated with, even scolded. When people describe God directly, they reach for a rich set of epithets. Modern language prefers phrases like the good, the gracious, the great, the almighty, and the beloved, while older Germanic speech offers an even wider palette. God is called rich, powerful, holy, mild, wise, eternal, and ruler-like. Many of these titles overlap with the language of kingship, because the easiest way to describe supreme authority is to borrow the vocabulary of earthly rule. Words meaning lord, ruler, commander, and protector become divine names in their own right. Some traditions emphasize God as the one who wields, the one who governs and holds the world together. Others stress the all-seeing aspect, A fortunate person is seen by God, while an unfortunate one is forgotten. To be remembered is a blessing, to be overlooked is a kind of abandonment. The father title deserves special attention. In the Norse world, Father of all is applied to the highest god as a creator and origin figure for gods and humans alike. In Christian speech, Father becomes central in a different way, tied to a moral and spiritual relationship, rather than a mythic genealogy. Yet the instinct to call the supreme power Father is older than any single creed. Greek and Roman religion tied their chief gods to fatherhood as well, and even local traditions gave maternal or paternal labels to a wide range of divine figures. These titles do not always reflect family structures in a literal sense. They function as a human way of naming authority, care, origin, and protection. Alongside father language, there is also a family of names that portray God as maker and measurer. Some older Germanic terms describe the creator as one who sets bounds, measures out form, and shapes the world as if crafting a well-proportioned figure. That imagery can be startlingly concrete. Creation is described as measuring, moulding, casting, shaping. The same verbs used for metalwork or sculpture can become sacred verbs. The divine act becomes craftsmanship, and the universe becomes a work made with skill, symmetry, and intention. This is why words meaning shaper or creator become common divine titles, and why poetry can speak of God measuring a person's beauty as if designing it with exact tools. Writers in the medieval world loved to describe the highest divine power with set, memorable lines that sounded almost ceremonial. These stock phrases show up again and again, especially in Romance storytelling, and they usually draw from the same pool of ideas. A god who dwells on high, who shaped the sky and earth, who commands storms and sunlight, who counts what humans cannot count, who gives life and judges all, who sees the hidden corners of the heart, and who never lies. The wording changes from language to language, but the logic stays stable. A storyteller wants a phrase that instantly signals authority and certainty, so they reach for images everyone recognizes: height, creation, control of nature, perfect knowledge, and absolute truth. Even in Germanic verse, the same patterns appear. God is described as the one who sits above, yet still sees below, the one who set the moon's light in place, the one who planned a person's life, the one whose power has no rival, the one who can give and take, and the one who formed both laughter and tears. In that world, the divine is not described in abstract philosophy. It is described through concrete actions that feel visible in daily life. Weather, growth, time, fate, and the private thoughts people try to hide. At the same time, some expressions carry older colouring that does not come from later church language, but from an earlier mythic imagination. In the northern tradition, the word for the gods as a group can point to a ranked divine society, almost like an upper class of powers who rule together. This idea is not limited to Scandinavia. Older Germanic languages show related forms, and traces of that older divine vocabulary survive in personal names, where an element meaning God or divine being sits inside compounds the way a sacred title might. What makes this especially intriguing is that the same word can appear with an everyday, physical meaning as well, like a beam or a ridge, suggesting an ancient habit of imagining the gods as supports of the sky or as powers tied to the backbone of the landscape. In poetry and folklore, divine powers are often pictured as what holds the world up, what binds it together, what gives it structure. That is why old phrases can place gods next to elves in the same breath, as if both were categories of invisible forces that can strike a person with sudden illness or misfortune. And it is why some early writers describe victorious leaders being praised as if they were not fully human, but semi-divine, using a term that looks like an older Germanic word for divine beings. In other words, the boundary between gods and heroes is not always clean. The language itself sometimes blurs it. Another strand deepens the picture: the idea of divine powers as a council. In the oldest layers of Northern myth, a word that originally meant council becomes, in the plural, a technical term for the gods, as if the gods are, by definition, the ones who consult together and set the course of the world. From there come expressions that describe the gods as merciful or joyful powers, and even a famous mythic phrase for the world's end that imagines a kind of twilight falling over the divine order. The language here makes the divine feel collective. The gods are a bound group, joined by ties, linked like a band. That same thought appears elsewhere through words that evoke binding, fastening, and joining, images of a cosmic brace that holds reality in place. These are not random metaphors. They match a worldview in which order is something maintained by powerful beings, and disorder is what happens when those ties loosen. Even certain titles that later sound completely ordinary may have older roots. A striking example is a title built from the word for victory. In Germanic cultures, victory was not only a military outcome, it was proof of divine favour and divine force. Northern myth gives victory titles to major gods, and later Christian poets transfer the same victory language to the Christian God without hesitation. That tells a simple story. Converts did not erase the emotional vocabulary of power. They repurposed it. A victorious god remained the most natural image of a supreme protector. It is even possible that a very old divine title, meaning the victorious one, helped shape later polite address forms that spread across different European languages, though that idea remains debated. Still, the broader pattern is clear. Older sacred vocabulary. From this point, the topic naturally shifts from names and phrases to practice, how people expressed reverence in action. The most basic human ways of maintaining a relationship with the divine were prayer and sacrifice. And in older thinking, the two belong together. A sacrifice is a prayer made physical, a request carried upward with a gift. Wherever people felt the need to ask for help, protection, or forgiveness, the impulse to offer something followed close behind. When early translators tried to express adoration and worship, they had to pick words from their own languages, and those choices reveal what worship looked like in the imagination. One Gothic verb used for adoration can suggest an act of approach or submission, rather than a purely inward feeling. The context sometimes shows a person falling forward, face down, in a posture that matches surrender as much as devotion. That raises a practical question. Was worship seen as drawing near, or as bending low, or as both at once? The texts do not always spell out the gesture, but they often imply it. Across the Germanic languages, the vocabulary of prayer moves between the everyday and the sacred. Words that mean ask, beg, or request can also mean pray, because prayer is, at its core, a plea. Over time, languages start to separate the categories more cleanly. So asking becomes an ordinary request, while praying becomes a specific religious act, and adoring becomes something stronger still. Yet the older layers often keep them blended. Some verbs for prayer may even carry a physical memory inside them. There are hints that a word for praying once included the sense of bending down or casting oneself toward the ground, as if the body's movement was part of the meaning. Other terms drift in the opposite direction. A word that originally meant to obtain or to receive can end up meaning to request, because successful asking and asking itself blur together in practice. Languages do this naturally. The goal of the action begins to stand for the action. Gesture mattered as much as vocabulary. Ancient observers describe people praying by looking up toward the sky, because the sky was imagined as the seat of power. Kneeling, bowing, and prostration appear widely, not only in Christian practice but in older traditions as well. Stories and laws preserve glimpses. People fall to the earth before an image, bow before a powerful figure, or kneel at someone's feet to show submission. Even outside religion, medieval etiquette keeps the same body language. Kneeling, bowing to a king, bending to a noble, even bowing toward a road, a homeland, or a sacred place as if blessing it. Reverence in that world is not abstract, it is performed. The body communicates what words cannot. Uncovering the head is another old sign of respect, and it appears to have been widespread. Yet there are also reports of priestly exceptions. In one tradition, certain priests offer sacrifices with covered heads while others stand bareheaded. That difference matters because it shows ritual is not merely personal emotion. It is a coded system, and different roles may require different signals. Later, popular custom keeps similar habits alive. People may honour a new moon by kneeling or removing a cap using gestures that look half religious, even when the belief behind them is fading. These are the kinds of survivals that reveal how deep ritual reflexes can run. Other gestures show up with equal clarity. Hands raised, palms stretched outward, arms extended as if presenting oneself openly to the divine. Stories of saints describe standing in cold water to pray, then kneeling on shore with hands lifted toward the heavens. Whether the details are literal or stylized, the point is consistent. Prayer is depicted as a full-body act. Even later medieval manuscripts sometimes prescribe strange measuring actions, with hands and body positions alongside prayers, as if physical patterning could reinforce spiritual intention. That kind of practice suggests a lingering belief that sacred power can be guided not only by words but by form, posture, and symbolic movement. Direction also becomes part of worship. Christian practice in many regions trained prayer toward the east, toward sunrise imagery and the idea of sacred light. In contrast, northern pagan practice is often described as turning toward the north during prayer or sacrifice. Those opposing habits eventually feed into a moral geography. The north becomes, in Christian imagination, the unblessed quarter, linked with older paganism, danger, and misfortune. That is why some legal and folk traditions treat northward orientation as unlucky, while eastward orientation becomes the proper posture for prayer. Medieval storytelling even plays with this contrast. One character prays in the Christian way, another in the old way, and the direction of the body becomes a quiet signal of religious identity. In the oldest Germanic-speaking worlds, the boundary between asking and receiving was never as sharp as modern language makes it. The very verbs that meant to request something could also mean to obtain it, and that overlap shaped how prayer was imagined. A plea was not only speech directed upward, it was a practical attempt to bring about a result. The more voices joined in, the stronger the request felt, as if many mouths speaking the same desire could press it into reality. Medieval poetry captures this mindset with a simple confidence. Divine mercy is generous, and it is hard to refuse when a whole group begs together with steady insistence. A chorus of supplication becomes a kind of force. The image is not of a lonely believer whispering in private, but of a collective appeal repeated until it seems inevitable that help will come. That belief also explains why communities valued public singing and ritual prayer. A sung plea is memorable, coordinated, and shared, and it sounds like a single will formed out of many individuals. Once worship moves from words to gifts, language becomes even more revealing. In later German, the everyday term for sacrifice came in through church usage and spread outward, carried by Christian vocabulary. But before that shift, older societies had their own native terms, some widespread, some regional, some tied to specific actions. What these older words show is that sacrifice was not defined by blood alone. In early translations of sacred texts, a verb that once belonged to pagan sacrifice could be used without embarrassment for Christian worship. That tells a quiet story. At first, the word meant to honour a god with ritual, not necessarily to slaughter. Only later did Christian speakers grow uncomfortable with a term that still smelled of older rites. In some dialects, the verb highlights the recipient, as if sacrifice is primarily about venerating a being. In others, it highlights the object offered, as if sacrifice is primarily about giving up something valuable. Both perspectives were real, and the vocabulary kept them side by side. Across the early Germanic languages, there were also words that focused on dedication, selecting something in advance for sacred use and declaring it set apart. The same root that could mean a solemn vow could also move toward the meaning of an offering, because a vow is essentially a promise of a future gift. In many societies, the vow works like a private sacrifice paid in advance. A person pledges something to a god, and the pledge itself creates obligation. Some terms suggest the act of handing over, others suggest approaching, stepping forward, or formally presenting the gift. Even verbs that normally mean to give or to set down can take on a sacrificial meaning when the context is ritual. This is why old texts sometimes describe sacrifice with ordinary verbs: bring, give, place, offer, because what matters is the social act. The god is treated like a powerful partner in an exchange. One of the most important ideas behind sacrifice is simple and surprisingly human. Food is pleasant to gods because food is pleasant to people. A sacrificial meal assumes that contact exists between the human community and the divine world. The god is invited to take a share, and in early imagination the god truly enjoys it. Only later do traditions develop clearer separations between human eating and divine food, or create symbolic substitutes that move sacrifice away from literal feeding. In older practice, however, the logic is direct. Gratitude becomes a meal offered upward, and fear becomes a gift meant to soften anger. The motives are remarkably consistent across cultures. People offer thanks to keep favour flowing, or they offer appeasement when they believe something has gone wrong: crop failure, famine, sickness, defeat, and social collapse. The aim is always the same: keep the powers gracious or make them gracious again. From that motive, sacrifice naturally divides into a few broad types. There are thanksgiving offerings, tied to prosperity and success, often celebrated with feasting. There are appeasing offerings, triggered by crisis and dread, performed when people believe the divine has turned against them. There are also offerings linked to decision-making, meant to secure support for an enterprise or to learn what the future holds. Divination could exist without sacrifice, but the two easily merge because the offering is a way of opening communication. Beyond these, special rites cluster around life's turning points: birth, marriage, death, enthronement, events that demand public recognition and carry a feeling of danger as well as hope. In many cases, the sacrifice is inseparable from the banquet, because the ritual is not only about the god, it is about binding the community together around a shared moment. The materials offered reveal another layer of worldview. Plant offerings, grain, fruit, flowers, carry an air of innocence and brightness. They look peaceful, and they fit agricultural life. Yet many societies felt that animal sacrifice carried a heavier weight. blood is dramatic. Life poured out seems to create a stronger bond, a stronger payment, a stronger cleansing. This is why warrior cultures and hunting cultures gravitate toward animal offerings, while farming communities may emphasize grain and harvest gifts, even if both exist side by side. The choice is not merely economic, it reflects what people consider powerful. A bowl of grain can be sacred, but a life surrendered in front of the community feels like an irreversible promise. Seasonal festivals grow out of that same logic. When offerings are made repeatedly for the same purpose, good harvest, peace, victory, the occasional rite turns into a calendar. In the northern world, the year could be marked by 3 major sacrificial seasons. One as winter approaches, one in the deep of winter, and one as summer comes on. Each has a clear intention. The autumn rite looks toward the coming cold and asks for a good year's yield. The midwinter rite asks for growth and renewal despite darkness. The summer rite seeks victory and success in conflict, travel, and work. Over time, communities fold these aims together, so a single national festival can ask for prosperity, peace, and victory all at once. Alongside the major ceremonies, smaller local offerings continue. Food, drink, cattle, household gifts, often performed by smaller groups or families. The great rites unite a people. The small rites maintain daily alignment. Echoes of older sacrifice also linger in customs that later look like mere folk celebration. Fire festivals in spring and summer, with their torches, embers, circle dances, and special baked loaves, point back to an older ritual logic. The flame is treated as sacred, not just useful. People rub or kindle it with ceremony, leap through smoke or pass near embers, throw flowers into it, distribute food connected to it, and dance in circles that mimic the cycle of the year. These actions can survive long after their original explanation fades, because they are dramatic, communal, and emotionally satisfying. In some regions, playful performances even preserve an older sacrificial memory through disguise and symbolic victims, where the ritual animal is represented by costume and gesture. The story has changed, but the shape of the rite remains recognizable. When crisis strikes, sacrifice becomes urgent again. Communities respond to famine, epidemic, or repeated defeat with heightened offerings, sometimes performed for long life, public favour, or relief from disaster. In these moments, a society's underlying assumptions come to the surface. The divine world is not distant. It reacts. If things go well, gratitude is appropriate. If things go badly, repair is necessary. And at the extreme edge of that logic lies the darkest category: human sacrifice. In many ancient cultures, human life was seen as the most costly payment, reserved for moments of severe catastrophe, terrifying omen, or perceived collective guilt. The idea is brutal, but consistent with the sacrificial worldview. The worse the threat, the higher the price that must be paid to cleanse it. Historical testimony from antiquity describes Germanic peoples practicing human sacrifice in specific contexts, often linking it to major gods associated with war, victory, and fate. Reports describe captives offered after battle, enemies dedicated in bulk, and ritual killings carried out at set times in sacred groves. In these accounts, the victims are frequently prisoners of war, purchased slaves, or those considered criminals. The logic is framed as fulfillment of a vow or payment for victory. If a god grants success, the promised price is delivered. Other reports describe a community purifying itself by killing a person in the name of the people, as if one life could absorb a collective stain. Whether every detail in these reports is accurate or exaggerated, they preserve a consistent picture of what outsiders believed they were witnessing. ritual violence tied to the sacred, not random cruelty. Later storytelling and folk memory preserve distorted shadows of the same idea. Tales in which a child is walled into a foundation, or a first crosser of a bridge is doomed, echo an old belief that a building, a boundary, or a new settlement demands a life to hold it in place. Even when the tale becomes a moral story rather than a ritual record, the structure remains. Something new is being founded, and a life is demanded as a price. The most telling detail in such stories is how the victim is sometimes given food or toys during the final moments, as if the right must maintain a strange tenderness, even while committing a terrible act. Ancient ritual often included music, noise, and distraction as well, not for celebration but to drown out cries and steady the crowd. Harsh acts rarely happen in silence. Societies create ritual sound to make them bearable. There are also traditions where extraordinary events demand extraordinary deaths. Some legends describe rulers offering their own children to secure a longer reign or protect a kingdom. Other stories go further, showing a king himself offered when the land suffers famine and nothing else seems to work. These narratives are extreme, but they fit the inner logic of expiation. When ordinary offerings fail, the highest value is demanded. A society that believes the divine controls harvest and health can come to believe that only the heaviest payment will break a curse. All of this, taken together, reveals the deeper structure behind early worship. Prayer is imagined as effective speech, made stronger by many voices. Sacrifice is imagined as a real exchange that maintains relationship. Gratitude pays back kindness. Appeasement repairs anger, and divination tries to secure guidance. Language preserves these assumptions in verbs that blur asking with getting, honouring with offering, giving with surrendering. Seasonal rites show how regular needs, food, peace, victory, become a calendar of sacred obligation. And the most frightening practices appear when people believe the world itself is out of balance and only life can pay for life. Across early Northern Europe, sacrifice was rarely imagined as a single action. It was a whole social event, a public language of power and negotiation. When people offered animals, they were not only handing something over to the unseen world. They were also gathering, eating, sharing, and confirming who belonged to the community and who did not. Animal sacrifice was usually tied to gratitude because prosperity demanded acknowledgement. Yet in times of fear, the same ritual could be used to calm what people believed was divine anger. In some traditions, an animal offering even served as a substitute for something harsher, a way to soften an older logic that demanded human life when disaster struck. Over time, animal sacrifice became the more common and socially acceptable form, partly because it could be folded into a feast rather than standing alone as pure violence. There was also a strong sense of fitness in what could be offered. A gift to a god had to feel worthy. If the sacrifice was framed as food shared with divine powers, then the animal had to be one that humans themselves considered proper to eat. Offering a creature that people regarded as repulsive would have broken the logic of the ritual. The gods were imagined as guests at the table, not as scavengers. That is why sacrifices so often turned into banquets. A portion was symbolically set aside for the divine, while the rest was cooked, carved, distributed, and eaten among those present. Participation mattered. Sharing the meat meant sharing in the sacred act, and the meal became a bond between the living community and the powers it depended on. This idea that unseen beings receive a portion did not stop with the great gods. Long after official cults changed, ordinary households still acted as if the home itself had listeners. People reserved bites, bowls, or small servings for house spirits, for protective beings who were believed to live close by. It is a simple habit with an ancient depth. Someone is always being included, even if they are not visible. Among sacrificial animals, none carried the same force of symbolism as the horse. Before Christianity reshaped food taboos, horse meat was widely eaten in many regions, and that fact matters because it shows the horse was not only sacred, but also socially usable as a ritual meal. Later, when conversion campaigns tried to draw hard boundaries, few customs caused more friction than the slaughter and eating of horses. For missionaries and newly converted elites, this practice looked like a stubborn attachment to the old gods. For communities, it was part of the old seasonal rhythm, tied to identity and tradition. When leaders wanted to prove they had truly embraced the new faith, abstaining from horse flesh became a public test. The horse also appears in older accounts in ways that reveal how sacrifice blended into warfare. After battle, the defeated enemy's animals and equipment could become offerings. Horse heads were especially charged symbols. They were sometimes displayed on poles or fixed to trees, not as decoration but as a statement that the victory had been handed over to the divine. A severed head could represent the entire animal, and the head, in many cultures, carried a concentrated meaning: identity, power, and a kind of spiritual weight. When we see horse heads shown as trophies in sacred settings, we are often seeing the remains of an offering, not a random act of cruelty. In northern assemblies, seasonal rites sometimes included the public killing of horses and cattle for the good of the year. The goal was practical: better harvest, stability through winter, success in conflict. The ritual could be framed as a repair of luck, an attempt to push the world back into balance. Descriptions of these gatherings often emphasize blood as a sacred material. Blood was collected, not wasted, because it had a function. It could be smeared onto sacred objects used to mark altars, or sprinkled on participants as a sign that they were inside the rite and under its protection. Even when the details differ between regions, that pattern repeats. The community does not only watch the sacrifice, it is physically included in it. Large festival accounts sometimes describe huge numbers of victims, including people and many kinds of animals. It is worth treating such numbers with caution, because ancient and medieval storytelling often used impressive totals as a way to express magnitude rather than give exact statistics. That said, the recurring themes are still revealing. Certain festivals were remembered as taking place on a repeating cycle, sometimes tied to a number that had symbolic weight. The image is consistent: a great national gathering where gifts are brought, animals are killed, and the sacred space becomes crowded with bodies, song, and smoke. Cattle offerings stand beside horse sacrifice in importance. Bulls and oxen appear as high-status victims, especially in rites connected to prosperity, law, and public order. In some stories, a bull is led forward as if the animal itself is a formal participant in a legal or sacred moment. In others, a victorious fighter kills a bull after a duel, using the same weapon that won the contest. The message is clear: victory is not complete until it is acknowledged in ritual form. Sacrifice becomes the signature at the end of an event, the proof that the outcome has been accepted by the invisible powers. Pigs and boars carry a different atmosphere. They belong to household wealth, winter survival, and seasonal feasting. In many northern regions, the midwinter table had a special prestige, and the boar appears as a festive emblem of abundance. Even when the old gods were no longer named, customs endured. Cakes shaped like boars, symbolic golden animals in folk belief, and ritualized distribution of meat at communal meals. These are not random traditions. They are the after-image of older offerings, transferred into new calendars and new religious language. Sheep and goats also appear in the sacrificial world, often as smaller offerings that could be performed more easily and more frequently. Sometimes a rite demanded a victim of a particular colour, and that detail is not trivial. Colour could be treated as a sign of purity, luck, or suitability. White animals often carried a favourable meaning, as if brightness and cleanliness made the offering more acceptable. Dark victims, in some contexts, appear in rites aimed at dangerous beings or anxious purposes. These patterns show how sacrifice was not only about what was offered, but about what the offering was supposed to accomplish. We also get hints that animals were adorned before death. Garlands, ribbons, and decorated horns are not just festive aesthetics. They are part of making the victim set apart, turning an ordinary creature into a sacred object. Leading the animal around the gathering space could serve a similar purpose, giving the impression that the victim was brought into the community's circle before being handed to the gods. Older ritual systems often preferred an animal that seemed unforced, uncontaminated by heavy labour, and not previously used in ordinary service. That is why certain legal ceremonies later demanded young or unused animals. The logic of sacred purity had already shaped what felt right. One striking point is what we do not see. In much of the northern material, sacrifice is not mainly a burnt offering reduced entirely to ash. It is food-based and communal. The animal is usually boiled rather than roasted, because boiling fits a large gathering, and it produces broth that can be shared. The cauldron becomes a central object, not only a cooking vessel, but a ritual centre. Later, folklore that obsesses over cauldrons, bubbling pots, and boiling spells may be inheriting a shadow of that older world, where communal boiling was a sacred act long before it became a symbol of witchcraft. In some accounts, ale appears directly in the ritual setting, not merely as a drink at the feast, but as part of the offering itself. Sometimes that looks like a drink gift poured out to a god. Sometimes it looks like a sacred vat prepared for a major ceremony. Even when the source is hostile or confused, the basic truth is plausible. Drink was a major medium of religious life because it brought people together, loosened speech, and turned a gathering into a shared emotional moment. From that world of sacred drink, we can understand a tradition that survived with remarkable stubbornness. The ritual toast of remembrance, what later cultures might call the memory cup. The logic is simple and powerful. At a banquet or assembly, people speak the name of someone absent or dead, then drink in their honour. The cup is not only alcohol, it is a public act of recall. It binds the group to a shared story. In the north, this remembrance could be directed toward gods at sacrificial feasts, and the same act could later be redirected toward Christian figures once conversion took hold. The structure remained even as the names changed. A toast that once honoured old powers could be repainted as a saint's blessing without changing how it felt in the room. This is where language itself tells a story. Words for memory, mind, and remembering can drift into the language of affection. To remember someone at the cup is to acknowledge attachment, loyalty, or love. Over time, the word for a remembrance toast can slide toward the sense of a loving dedication. Medieval writers sometimes describe the custom in religious terms, sometimes in social terms, but the social function remains stable. Before parting, before travel, before danger, people share a drink that is supposed to protect friendship and strengthen peace. In many communities, certain sacred figures become especially linked with these parting toasts, because people want safety, honesty, and protection from hidden threats. The toast becomes a shield made of words and ritual. Among the Suevi, a scene unfolds that reveals how deeply ritual drinking was woven into older belief. A missionary approaches a gathering where men are lifting a vessel in honor of Woden, invoking his memory as they pass the drink from hand to hand. The moment is not casual. It is ceremonial, deliberate, charged with meaning. According to later accounts, the saint intervenes dramatically, shattering the container and declaring that something darker than ale had filled it. In his interpretation, the act of drinking in the god's name was not harmless remembrance, but a channel through which souls were being claimed. This pattern appears again in northern tradition. There are references to great quantities of ale promised to Odin, toasts offered jointly to Thor and Odin, and cups raised explicitly in their memory. To drink a god's minna was not simply to recall him, but to reaffirm allegiance. The ritual bound community and deity together in a shared act. The spoken name, the lifted cup, and the communal draught formed a compact. When Christianity spread through the north, the outward form of the custom endured even as the names invoked began to change. In earlier times, worshippers traced the sign of Thor's hammer over the vessel. Later, the cross replaced it. Blessing the cup became a Christian gesture, yet structurally it echoed what had come before. The act of marking the drink transformed it into something protected, something claimed for a sacred purpose. Even long after open pagan worship faded, echoes of sacred drinking survived. In certain German villages, a blessed chalice of wine was shared annually in church as a form of communal protection and goodwill. In Scandinavia, special toasts at midwinter, or Candlemas, carried forward the idea that drink could seal bonds between people and the unseen powers governing fortune. The language shifted, but the gesture remained recognizable. The vessel itself held symbolic weight. The large communal cup described among early Germanic peoples was not merely a container. It functioned almost like a portable sanctuary. Comparable cauldrons appear in accounts of northern myth, sometimes guarded, sometimes contested, sometimes retrieved by force from giants or enemies. Names that incorporate references to kettles suggest that such objects could even become personal identifiers, marking families or individuals as connected to sacred rites. Beyond drink, traces of older rituals survived in bread and baked offerings. Medieval sources mention figures moulded from dough, shaped into animals or divine forms. In one northern saga, women sit by the fire, baking images of the gods, tending them, anointing them, even dressing them. A story tells of a carved or baked figure of Balder thrown into the flames, its fat catching fire and spreading destruction through the house. These details blur the line between symbol and offering. The representation becomes inseparable from the act. In other regions, seasonal customs involved straw figures placed near the hearth. If the weather proved favourable, the figure might be treated kindly. If not, it was abused or discarded. The rhythm is clear: shaping, honouring, rejecting, destroying. Ritual objects were not inert decorations, but participants in a drama of hope and anxiety. Many customs that appear puzzling at first glance may descend from these older sacrificial patterns. The careful choice of an animal's colour, the ceremonial leading of a boar around a gathering, the scattering of flowers, the form of festive loaves, and above all the structured act of drinking in someone's name, all may preserve fragments of rites once directed openly toward pre-Christian gods. Alongside sacrifice and prayer stood another central feature of early worship: the ceremonial movement of divine images. The sacred presence was not confined to one fixed location. At certain times it travelled through the land, carried in wagons or borne by attendants. Ancient accounts describe a goddess drawn among her people, a springtime procession of a fertility god, or the solemn transport of a sacred plough or ship. These journeys were not spectacles alone. They extended blessing across fields and settlements, symbolically renewing the bond between deity and territory. After conversion, such processions did not vanish. Instead, statues of the Virgin or local saints replaced earlier figures. In times of drought, plague, or war, sacred images were carried across fields or through town streets, prayers rising for rain, healing, or victory. The pattern remained intact. Movement through space, invocation of protection, communal participation. Even the practice of bringing holy objects to extinguish fires reflects the enduring belief that divine presence could intervene directly in crisis. Descriptions survive of parishes organising annual circuits, carrying their patron through outlying lands, blessing homes, collecting alms for the poor, and spending nights in vigil. The stated goal was fertility of the soil and relief from harsh weather. Such rites closely resemble older agricultural purifications known from classical antiquity. The boundary walk, the blessing of roads, and the ceremonial visitation of fields all echo a worldview in which territory must be ritually secured. These practices point toward an earlier stage in which sacred space was inseparable from landscape. Before stone temples dominated the imagination, divinity was encountered in groves, on hills, beside rivers. Words for temple often overlapped with words for forest or clearing. A holy place might be nothing more than a stand of trees marked off from ordinary use, entered with caution, bound by custom. Roman observers noted that Germanic peoples did not confine their gods within walls or shape them into human likenesses. Instead, they consecrated groves and named the unseen presence that dwelled there. Certain forests were approached only under ritual constraint. Entry could require symbolic gestures of submission. Sacred wagons rested in hidden clearings. Animal heads hung from branches as tokens of sacrifice. Centuries later, missionaries encountered these sanctuaries. Accounts describe massive oaks dedicated to older gods, surrounded by communities who watched anxiously as axes struck the trunk. When the tree fell without catastrophe, many interpreted the event as proof of the old god's weakness. Churches rose from the timber of felled, sacred trees, transforming sites of former worship into Christian centres. Similar episodes appear across Frankish, Burgundian, Lombard, and Anglo-Saxon territories. Priests burned temples hidden among trees, toppled idols, and redirected the devotion of local populations. Sometimes, the destruction provoked violent reaction. At other times, it passed with surprisingly little resistance. Frequently, new churches were erected directly on the ruins of earlier shrines, reusing the space while redefining its meaning. In Northern Europe, the sacred grove remained particularly resilient. Descriptions tell of temple enclosures surrounded by untouched woodland, trees considered holy because of the blood of sacrifices. In some places, no branch could be cut and no animal killed within the boundaries. The forest itself functioned as temple, altar, and symbol combined. Over time, the architectural temple became more prominent. Yet even then, language preserved memory of wooded sanctuaries. Terms that once meant grove came to signify shrine, altar, or idol. The transition did not erase the past, it layered new forms upon old foundations. Across regions and centuries, the pattern repeats. A sacred tree stands at the centre of communal life. A vessel of ale seals loyalty to a god. Animal heads hang from branches. Processions circle fields to secure harvest. Then comes a turning point. A tree falls. A temple burns. A cross replaces a hammer sign. Still, the gestures endure. The cup is blessed. The procession continues. The land is circled in prayer. Along the wind-beaten edge of the North Sea, travellers once reached an island that locals treated as untouchable ground. The community said it belonged to a god named Foset, and even the island's name carried that claim. Shrines had been raised there in his honour, and the place was guarded, not by soldiers, but by fear, custom, and strict habit. No one dared lay a hand on anything living there. Grazing animals were left alone, objects were not taken, and even the most ordinary actions were performed under rules that turned daily life into ritual. A spring bubbled up on the island, yet the water was drawn only in silence, as if speech itself might offend the power believed to dwell in the source. That kind of reverence makes the next pattern easier to understand, because across the early medieval frontier, the conflict was rarely only about belief. It was also about sacred property, protected spaces, and the public humiliation of old gods. In Frisian territory, a group of eager converts began tearing down local shrines wherever they could, breaking what they saw as false sanctuaries and reducing them to nothing. The reaction was immediate and violent. Those who still held to the older ways rushed in with fury, striking hard and fast, not simply to punish vandalism, but to stop an attack on the spiritual order of their world. In one attack, a servant of the new faith was beaten with clubs until he was covered in wounds. The message was clear: destroy a god's place, and the community will answer. Yet the same regions also show a second path, one that appears again and again wherever conversion took root. Some missionaries and bishops did not merely preach, they negotiated the right to dismantle temples in full view of the people, turning demolition into a public turning point. When a shrine was pulled down, valuables were sometimes found inside, gold and silver that had been offered or stored there over time. Those treasures could be seized and redirected into royal hands, both enriching rulers and demonstrating that the old sanctuaries no longer had protection. It is a blunt detail, but it fits the reality of the moment. Sacred sites were not only spiritual centres, they were repositories of wealth and symbols of local independence. Taking them apart was a religious act and a political one at the same time. Even place names preserve the memory of this older landscape. In some districts, a location carried a name meaning the Shrine of Mars, not because a Roman cult still flourished there in a pure form, but because the site's identity had been shaped by an earlier sanctuary that people continued to remember long after the rituals had shifted. Over centuries, the precise god attached to a spot could change, or a local deity could be translated into a familiar foreign label. But the core fact remained. This was a place once marked out for worship, set apart from ordinary land. One of the most revealing points is how often these sanctuaries were not described as groves alone, but as structures, shrines, halls, enclosed spaces that could be burned, levelled, and replaced. The famous sanctuary destroyed in the early imperial period was treated like a real building, something that could be flattened to the ground rather than simply cut down like a stand of trees. After that, direct descriptions become rare for a long stretch, but the silence does not mean temples vanished. When evidence returns in the early medieval period, it appears across many Germanic communities: Franks, Lombards, Alemanni, Anglo-Saxons, and Frisians. The sources speak in different tones, and some cases leave open whether an older Roman building was being reused, tolerated, or reoccupied. In certain regions, the conquerors may have allowed remnants of earlier local cults to continue. In others, they may have taken over sturdy Roman sites for their own rights. Both scenarios could happen side by side in the same century. The vocabulary of sacred buildings suggests variety rather than a single standard design. Some shrines were likely small, timber constructions, simple wooden huts built around a sacred tree or within a fenced enclosure. Others were more substantial halls, the kind of places that demanded stronger materials and could dominate a settlement. Different words carried different shades of meaning. Some implied a modest praying house or a simple sacred shelter, while others suggested a larger temple hall, an aula-like space suited for communal gatherings. The important point is not architectural elegance, but function. These were places where offerings were made, oaths might be sworn, and communal identity was publicly affirmed. The wave of destruction described in missionary narratives can sound one-sided at first, as if villagers simply watched helplessly while their sanctuaries burned. A closer look changes that picture. In several cases, the decision to attack a sacred tree or shrine was taken only after consultation with locals, who had already shifted toward the new faith. Large escorts were involved when resistance was likely, and when the older worshippers did respond, they did so with weapons and sheer numbers. The burning of a temple could become a flashpoint that demanded reconciliation afterward, because it exposed a community split between old and new loyalties. Another pattern appears repeatedly. The new religion often claimed the same ground rather than abandoning it. Churches and monasteries were built directly on the sites of destroyed sanctuaries, or their materials were reused. This strategy did more than save labour. It allowed people to feel that the place remained sacred, only now redefined. A location that had long carried dread and reverence could be reinterpreted as holy in a new way, without forcing the population to sever every emotional bond to the landscape. That helps explain why physical remains of pagan temples are so scarce. Many were burned, dismantled, or absorbed into later buildings until the old outline disappeared. From this, a broader conclusion forms. Early worship often centered on groves and open sacred places, meadows near water, hilltops, forests that felt ancient and watched. Later, built temples rose in those same zones, and the same places could also serve as legal and communal centers. The sacred and the judicial overlapped. A holy site was not simply where people prayed. It could also be where they gathered to decide disputes and declare public decisions. The overlap becomes even clearer when attention turns to the people who served these sites. The most basic label for a priest in early Germanic speech is built from the very word for God, as if the office were defined not by ritual technique, but by direct association with the divine. In northern tradition, the term for priest could be paired with the name of a shrine, producing expressions that literally mean temple priest or shrine guardian. Other older terms connect the priest to the sacred grove itself, suggesting that the earliest priesthood belonged as much to the landscape as to any building. These officials were not limited to sacrifice. In early descriptions, discipline during war is placed in priestly hands, not because commanders lacked authority, but because war was imagined as being fought under the gaze of the gods. Punishment, binding, and even the right to strike could be framed as actions carried out under divine command rather than personal anger. Public divination also falls under priestly supervision. Rituals using carved rods or the watching of sacred animals could be directed by a priest when a decision concerned the whole people. Yet private households sometimes performed their own divination without needing an official mediator, a reminder that early societies could be intensely communal in public matters and fiercely autonomous in private ones. The priesthood's status seems tied to the elite, but not in a simple way. Some traditions present a permanent high priest who stands above political danger, while kings themselves remain exposed to fate and conflict. Elsewhere, the priesthood appears hereditary, passing through families, particularly when a household maintained a sanctuary dedicated to a specific god. Naming practices could signal dedication. Fathers, dedicating sons to a deity, and those sons inheriting both a divine association and a social role linked to ritual leadership. In such settings, the priest was not only a religious specialist, but a local anchor of authority. When Christianity expanded, the story did not unfold as a total replacement of personnel. Foreign words for clergy entered the language, but older ideas did not vanish overnight. Some former pagan leaders likely became the fiercest opponents of conversion, while others became its most effective advocates, precisely because they understood the mental world of the people. That is why later church writers sometimes complain about mixed practices. Priests who blended old sacrifices with Christian forms, or performed sacred acts carelessly, leaving communities uncertain about what was truly being done. The struggle was not always between two separate populations. It could unfold inside the same village and even inside the same clergy. In the north, the record is uneven, but the outlines remain visible. Priests are shown advising on sacrifices and on legal judgments, as though both belonged to the same sacred sphere. The Icelandic world even carried older titles into Christian times, preserving certain legal functions under names that originally belonged to pagan religious leaders. At the local level, communities often granted special privileges to those attached to old sacred sites. Control over communal objects, rights tied to land, and responsibilities that looked like echoes of temple stewardship. Alongside male priests, the sources repeatedly grant women a striking role. They are treated not as passive observers, but as figures believed to possess insight, foresight, and a kind of sacred authority. Roman observers claim that communities listened to women's counsel and did not casually dismiss their responses. In wartime, women could influence decisions through interpretations of signs, casting lots, or reading omens. One report states that mothers decided whether battle should be joined, and even fixed limits, such as forbidding combat before a certain phase of the moon. Whether every detail is accurate matters less than what the report assumes. That a woman's judgment could carry religious weight and steer public action. History rarely hands over neat lists of names from the religious life of early Germanic Europe, especially when it comes to male seers. The record is far kinder to another figure, the prophetess. Roman observers who watched the frontier with a mix of fear and fascination noticed that certain women were treated as more than simply respected elders. They were approached as living channels of fate, believed to carry a sacred sight that ordinary people lacked. Among the Bructeri, one such woman rose to extraordinary prominence. Her name, Veleda, appears not as a minor curiosity, but as a political force. She was widely revered, and not only within her own people. Her authority spread across neighbouring groups, strengthened by the belief that she had foreseen major victories and disasters in advance. In a world where prophecy could be taken as proof that the gods favoured a cause, a woman who got it right could become untouchable in the public imagination. That untouchability was carefully managed. When alliances were being negotiated along the Rhine, some communities tried to place Veleda at the centre of diplomacy. The idea was simple. If agreements were confirmed in her presence, they carried the weight of something higher than human promises. Yet access to her was controlled. Visitors were not permitted to approach her face to face. The restriction was deliberate because distance itself increased her power. She was kept out of reach, as if the ordinary act of looking at her too closely would dissolve the spell of reverence. When consultation was needed, she did not descend into the crowd. She remained elevated, positioned in a tower, and selected intermediaries delivered questions and returned with answers. The arrangement made her seem less like a person giving opinions, and more like an oracle whose words arrived from above. At some point, Veleda's story turned darker. Sources hint that she eventually became a captive, and later, writers treat her name as something that could be mentioned in the same breath as prisoners brought to triumphal displays. The details are incomplete, as if a crucial portion of the narrative has been swallowed by the loss of earlier texts. Still, even fragments suggest how famous she remained. Her name continued to circulate as an emblem of captured prophecy, a reminder that even revered voices could be silenced when empires tightened their grip. Veleda was not presented as a one-time exception. The same observers note that earlier generations had honoured other women in comparable roles, and that several names were remembered. One appears under a form that does not sound like a native Germanic name, which has led later readers to suspect that outsiders reshaped it into something they could pronounce or interpret. Whether that suspicion is correct or not, the point stands. The category existed. Veleda belonged to a tradition, not an isolated accident, and the tradition did not end with her. A later prophetess known as Ganna appears in Roman narrative as well, described as a successor in the same prophetic line, as if the frontier still produced women whose authority could be recognized across tribal boundaries. Long after the Roman period, echoes of this pattern reappear in Christian-era stories. A ruler is said to have consulted a woman believed to be possessed by a spirit of divination, expecting her to reveal what was coming. The language is Christian and hostile, framing her gift as something uncanny, even dangerous, but the underlying behaviour is familiar. Political power still sought certainty from a woman believed to see beyond ordinary sight. Later, notices mention another prophetic woman who travelled from Alemannic territory to a major church centre. Even when the world had officially changed, the old appetite for prophecy had not disappeared. The role survived, though it was increasingly described in suspicious terms. This is not limited to Germanic lands. Roman authors also describe similar scenes in Britain, where women in a frenzy are shown shouting of ruin and catastrophe, as if the battlefield itself stirred prophetic voices into action. And beyond those reports stands a more poetic expression of the same idea, the towering figure of the seeress in northern tradition, the one who speaks as if the future is already written, and the end of all things can be recited in calm, terrible clarity. Prophecy becomes more than a trick or a performance. It becomes a worldview, history moving toward an inevitable conclusion that the prophetess can already see. Older descriptions of priestesses push the image even further into something almost cinematic. On one side stand the refined oracular women, like Veleda, guarded by ritual distance. On the other stand terrifying ritual specialists, described in stark detail. Barefoot, white-robed, bound with metal clasps, moving among captives, cutting throats, catching blood, reading signs in a sacrificial vessel. The account is shaped by an outsider's horror, but it preserves a striking link between prophecy and priestly action. The prophetess is not only a speaker, she can also be the one who performs the rite, and the rite itself becomes a language that is read like a message from the unseen world. That link between women and sacred service also appears in northern stories, though with a different emphasis. In one Roman description, a male priest escorts the divine presence and controls the sacred vehicle of a goddess. In Scandinavia, stories sometimes reverse the roles. A god's sacred journeys are attended by a young woman chosen for his service, travelling with the divine image as it moves through communities. The narrator who preserved the story writes with a Christian scowl, eager to make the whole scene look shameful, but the structure remains clear. A virgin-like attendant accompanies the god's public circuit, and the journey functions as a ritual of blessing. The people do not merely worship in one fixed place. The sacred presence visits them. Northern terminology even provides titles for women in these roles, matching the vocabulary used for male cult leaders. Specific women are remembered as temple priestesses in local tradition, not because later writers admired them, but because communities remembered them that way. Even so, the surviving stories focus more often on women as diviners than as formal ritual officials. Again and again, what stands out is the gift of foresight. A woman, too old and weak to leave her bed, is still portrayed as a central figure because a spirit of prophecy is believed to seize her and speak through her. The setting changes, the religious labels shift, but the pattern persists. Prophecy is imagined as something that can inhabit a person, not merely a set of techniques. Some of the most revealing clues are the names themselves. Certain personal names in Northern story look like they were chosen to signal a prophetic identity, not simply family lineage. A recurring element linked to female divinity or numinous power appears in the names of seeresses, as if the culture had a vocabulary for woman who stands close to the unseen. Another key term describes the classic wandering prophetess, a woman who moves from place to place, performs revelations, and carries social authority precisely because she is not fully inside normal life. Later tradition attaches that word to a single, almost mythic figure, but earlier usage suggests it was once a type, not a single character. Some stories preserve striking names for such women and give them distinctive traits. A seeress who rides among wolves, a prophetess living in a cave, a wise woman whose words shift political decisions like a king's decree. A wider circle of female figures sits on the border between human and divine. Certain virgins receive honours that look almost like worship, and titles are granted that imply connection to sacred places and holy enclosures. These are not simply characters in a story. They reflect a worldview where exceptional women could be treated as something more than human, especially when prophecy was involved. Virgin status, isolation, residence on cliffs or in towers, guarded access, attendance, sacred names, and ritual authority all blend into a single portrait. The woman who belongs to the community, yet stands above it, feared and consulted at once. From this point, the discussion naturally turns toward a larger question. What kind of religion produced such roles, and what does the shared language of worship reveal about shared beliefs? Across the Germanic world, words for sacrifice, sanctuary, and priesthood align in ways that are difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Northern terms match older traces in other dialects, not only in sound, but in meaning. That linguistic continuity usually reflects continuity in practice as well. Sacred groves appear as early centres of worship. Offerings are made there. Divination is conducted there. Priests manage ritual and public decisions. Wise women carry extraordinary authority that can look almost divine. This continuity matters because a later theory tries to erase it. Some writers have claimed that early Germanic religion was nothing more than a crude reverence for nature, without real gods, without named divine personalities, without a structured cult. The argument often leans on late Christian descriptions that condemn rural superstition. People making vows at trees, leaving offerings at springs, honouring groves and stones, clinging to old habits even after baptism. Those texts are real and they capture something true. They show practices that survived among ordinary people and were repeatedly targeted by sermons and laws. But they do not capture the whole earlier religion. They record what remains when a system has been broken, pressured underground, and stripped of its public leadership. By the time many of those condemnations were written, old worship no longer operated freely. Temples had been attacked. Ritual specialists were pushed out or absorbed into new structures. People who still felt the pull of older customs practiced them quietly, sometimes mixing them with Christian forms. In that situation, religion becomes fragmented. It turns into local habits, charms, private rites, half-remembered offerings at water and wood. Later observers then describe those fragments as if they were the original faith itself. That is like judging a shattered vessel by its smallest shards and insisting it was never whole. A stronger picture emerges from earlier and more detailed observers who wrote when the old religion still had public strength. Those accounts speak openly of gods, not merely trees and rivers. They describe public priests, national divination, sacred symbols carried into battle, and a god believed to command war itself. They even preserve native divine names and connect them to stories of origin, heroic descent, household protectors, and local sanctuaries. The descriptions also show that the Romans recognized different categories of divine beings: public gods, household gods, gods tied to marriage, gods tied to place, and gods invoked before major political acts. That is not the language of a religion without gods. It is the language of a complex system that outsiders try to translate into their own categories. The disagreement with an earlier Roman writer who claimed the Germans honoured only a few visible powers can be explained without forcing a denial of the later evidence. Roman authors often simplified what they saw, especially when they wanted to contrast one people with another. Limiting a foreign religion to a short list made it easier to frame as primitive, even if the reality was richer. And when the list includes the sun and moon, it clashes with a deeply rooted Germanic habit of imagining these heavenly bodies with specific, gendered identities that do not match Roman assumptions. Simplification is not the same as accurate description. Beyond Rome, the broader European context matters. Germanic peoples lived among Celts, Slavs, and other neighbouring cultures that all had named gods and structured worship. Slavic groups spread across vast regions still shared core divine figures. It would be strange if Germanic communities alone had remained trapped in a vague worship of stuff, with no deities, no sacred personalities, no mythic relationships. Language itself argues against it. When separate branches of a people share old religious terms across distance and time, that usually means the underlying ideas were once shared as well. Legal traditions also preserve blunt evidence. A law that sets a penalty for violating a temple and states that the offender is to be sacrificed to the gods of that sanctuary does not describe a nature cult without gods. It assumes named divine ownership of sacred property. It assumes a ritual logic. It assumes that the gods are real actors in the social order, not metaphors. So, a coherent timeline appears. In the early centuries of the Common Era, Germanic religion is best understood as a system centered on gods. In the far north, where conversion came late, that system survived longest and is recorded most fully. In central regions, where conversion came earlier and pressure was stronger, the gods appear in later sources only dimly, often filtered through hostile Christian language. But even in that hostile light, they remain gods, not mere trees and puddles. A final complication concerns images and temples. One early observer claims that the Germans did not display carved statues of their gods in human form, at least not in the regions most accessible to Roman scrutiny. Instead, there were sacred signs and symbolic forms, carved and painted objects that pointed to divine attributes. That claim is plausible for a period with limited artistic infrastructure and a strong preference for sacred places in nature. Yet it does not mean the gods were imagined as formless. Gods with human emotions, family ties, conflicts, and alliances are difficult to conceive without some mental image of personhood. Even without statues, people can imagine gods as human-like beings. Poetry alone can give them faces. and the later evidence strongly suggests that images did appear. The most dramatic early scene involves a covered sacred wagon carrying a divine image through a Gothic community. A ruler uses the moving statue as a test of loyalty. People are ordered to bow and sacrifice, and those who refuse are punished. This is not a vague reverence for nature. It is a public ritual centered on an image of a god, transported in a ceremonial vehicle. The pattern is ancient and widely spread. Similar sacred wagons appear in northern stories, where a god's presence journeys among the people to bless the land. Later, medieval war carts and religious processions echo the same logic. A holy presence carried through space becomes a public act of power. Other stories show how complicated the transition to Christianity could be. A Christian queen trying to convert her husband mocks the old gods as lifeless objects made of wood, stone, or metal, shaped by human hands and therefore unworthy of worship. The speech is obviously shaped by Christian argument, yet it reveals what it expects the audience to accept as normal: the presence of idols and named gods within a Frankish royal world. The narrative also shows how events were interpreted through religious rivalry. A child's death is taken as proof against the new god. The old gods are credited with power simply because misfortune follows a Christian rite. That kind of reasoning belongs to a society that sees divine forces as active competitors. Perhaps the most vivid conversion episode takes place on the shores of Lake Constance. Missionaries arrive at a small Christian sanctuary and discover something startling. 3 gilded bronze images fixed to the wall, honoured by local people who still sacrifice to them while neglecting the Christian altar. The community calls these figures the old guardians of the place, protectors who have preserved them and their land. In a single scene, 2 worlds overlap in the same building. A Christian space exists, but a pagan majority has effectively occupied it, folding it into older worship. When the missionary smashes the images publicly and casts the fragments into the lake, some spectators convert. Others, no doubt, seethe. The story captures the messy middle ground where religion is not a clean replacement, but a struggle over spaces, objects, and legitimacy. A question remains in such cases. Were the images Roman or Germanic? The location makes Roman survivals conceivable. The language of guardians of the place sounds like something that could fit older provincial cult. Yet centuries of Germanic settlement had already reshaped the region, and local popular worship by that time was unlikely to be purely Roman. The grouping of 3 deities worshipped together also fits a pattern more comfortably associated with Germanic tradition than with standard Roman temple arrangement. Even if the images began as Roman, they could have been reinterpreted, renamed, and absorbed into a Germanic sacred logic. In real frontier zones, religious ownership is not always original ownership. Sacred objects travel across identities. When exploring early Saxon religion, one of the most striking accounts comes from a medieval chronicler who described a Saxon victory in the 6th century near the river Unstrut. After their triumph, the warriors are said to have raised an eagle at the eastern gate of a captured stronghold and constructed an altar to celebrate victory. According to the writer, they honoured their ancestral gods in forms that reminded him of classical deities. He compared one of their gods to Mars, another to Hercules, and another to Apollo, reflecting the common medieval habit of interpreting northern gods through Roman and Greek lenses. This comparison does not mean the Saxons worshipped Roman gods directly. Rather, it reveals how later observers tried to make sense of unfamiliar traditions by translating them into names they already understood. Later, medieval notes add further layers to this picture. In one tradition, a place called Eresburg was linked to a shrine associated with Mars and Mercury. A statue of a war god was imagined as standing upon the city wall, dominating the settlement, while another deity connected to trade was honoured in the marketplace. Whether every detail of these stories is historically precise is less important than what they reveal. The memory of powerful sacred images standing publicly within fortified towns. Evidence from Frisian regions also points toward the presence of divine images in temples. Some sources mention sacred fountains and shrines without clearly describing statues, but others speak more directly. Missionaries who challenged pagan worship sometimes broke smaller idols before confronting larger ones. Accounts describe ropes tied to towering statues, attempts to pull them down, prayers uttered before the final effort, and eventually the crashing fall of the image. Once toppled, these statues were smashed into fragments and reduced to dust. Such episodes show that sacred images were not abstract ideas. They were physical objects, visible and imposing, placed at the heart of communal ritual life. Other narratives describe temples containing columns crowned with images of Mars and Mercury, where festivals were held and incense offered. When storms interrupted pagan ceremonies and fear spread among the worshippers, some communities turned to baptism, and the statues they had once revered were broken apart and thrown into nearby lakes. The destruction of these figures symbolized a dramatic shift in belief. The broken pieces of stone and wood marked the end of one sacred order and the beginning of another. Accounts from the 8th century speak even more clearly about statues. Preachers condemned the folly of seeking help from silent stones and lifeless images. In response, those devoted to their traditional gods reacted with anger, insisting that no outsider should insult their deities. Such confrontations show that sacred images were central to religious identity. They were not marginal decorations, but embodiments of divine presence. The cultural bridge between the Frisians and the Scandinavians makes it highly likely that similar practices existed across the North Sea world. In Scandinavia, temples contained carved figures of the gods. These images were often made of wood, sometimes adorned with gold or silver, occasionally clothed or decorated with arm rings. In great sanctuaries, 3 principal gods might stand together, with the most powerful seated in the centre. In some accounts, the central figure was Thor, placed prominently on a high seat, while other deities stood at his sides. These descriptions suggest organised temple worship, with carefully arranged divine statues. Smaller portable images also existed. Some individuals carried carved figures hidden in their clothing, worshipping privately when living among Christians. Pillars carved with the likeness of Thor stood in halls and on ships. In certain sagas, statues were believed to move slightly, to raise a hand, or to loosen a ring from an arm in response to offerings and prayers. These stories reflect a belief that the divine presence animated the image in some mysterious way. Sacred figures were not thought of as mere wood or stone, but as vessels of power. Not all statues were necessarily wooden. While timber was abundant in northern forests and suited to carving, stone images likely existed as well. The complete disappearance of these figures today should not be surprising. Just as temples were destroyed or replaced, statues were burned, shattered, or reused. Even in Scandinavia, where conversion occurred later, almost none of the great pagan idols survived intact. One particularly important term appears in early German sources, Irminsul. Chronicles describe how a sacred pillar bearing this name was destroyed during campaigns against the Saxons. Sometimes it is called a temple, sometimes a sacred grove, sometimes an idol. The descriptions suggest a tall wooden column erected in the open air and deeply revered. The name itself was interpreted to mean something like universal pillar, as though it symbolized a cosmic support holding up the world. This pillar may have represented a sacred tree trunk, perhaps minimally shaped, standing beneath the sky. The idea of the tree and the statue often merged in early worship. A carved trunk could function as both living symbol and crafted image. When missionaries destroyed the Irminsul, they were not merely cutting wood, they were striking at a visible centre of communal belief. Later, churches rose on or near such sites, transforming sacred ground into Christian space. Roman authors who wrote about Germanic religion usually translated foreign gods into familiar Roman names. Instead of preserving native names, they identified Germanic deities with Mercury, Mars, or Jupiter. Mercury, surprisingly, was often described as the chief god among certain tribes. This likely reflects both Roman interpretation and the influence of neighbouring Celtic traditions, where a similar god held prominence. Mars and Hercules also appear in these accounts, standing in for Germanic gods associated with war or strength. Jupiter, the Roman thunder god, appears less often in early descriptions, though later sources connect him with northern thunder deities. Such translations became standard practice. Once a Roman name was applied to a Germanic god, it circulated for centuries in Latin writings. This long-standing habit even influenced the naming of the days of the week. The 7-day week, inherited from the ancient Near East and adopted by Rome, associated each day with a planetary deity. As this system spread into Germanic lands, the names were adapted rather than rejected. Sunday and Monday reflected the sun and moon. Tuesday became associated with a war god corresponding to Mars. Wednesday carried the name of Woden, linked to Mercury. Thursday honoured Thor, identified with Jupiter. Friday bore the name of a goddess comparable to Venus. Only Saturday diverged in some regions, either retaining a form connected to Saturn or adopting a different local term. These weekday names spread widely across Germanic languages, from Old English and Old Norse to Dutch and Frisian. Despite regional variations, the pattern remained remarkably consistent. This consistency suggests that the planetary system of naming days had already become familiar before the full spread of Christianity. Later, Christian practice replaced certain pagan references, especially for Sunday and sometimes Saturday, but the older divine names endured. The survival of these names offers indirect but powerful evidence of pre-Christian belief. Even after temples were torn down and statues shattered, echoes of the old gods lingered in everyday speech. Each time people named a weekday, they unknowingly preserved a memory of ancient worship. The idea that Christians introduced the 7-day week and its planetary names does not withstand serious examination. The system of naming the days after gods had already taken firm root among pagan Romans, long before Christianity became dominant. In a world where Romans, Gauls, and Germanic peoples were in constant contact through trade, warfare, and diplomacy, cultural elements spread rapidly. The week and its divine associations would have moved just as easily across these frontiers. Christianity inherited the Jewish structure of the week, but it encountered already established day names in the Roman world. Church leaders tolerated these names reluctantly, even when they found them offensive, because they were too deeply embedded in daily speech to be completely removed. Clerical discomfort with these pagan names is visible in medieval writings. Some church authorities openly expressed hostility toward the continued use of names derived from old gods. In certain regions, attempts were even made to replace them with simple numerical terms. Such efforts reveal something important. If Christian teachers had originally created or approved these names, there would have been no reason for them to struggle against them later. The persistence of divine day names suggests that they predated widespread Christian influence and were already familiar to the population by the time conversion began. Another question naturally arises. If the naming system had truly been introduced under Christian guidance, why would Latin gods have been translated into Germanic equivalents in the first place? Why make the pagan framework more accessible by substituting local divine names for Roman ones? The more reasonable conclusion is that these identifications were already customary, formed in earlier centuries when Germanic and Roman religious worlds overlapped. Roman writers regularly equated foreign gods with their own through Interpretatio Romana, identifying local deities with Mercury, Jupiter, or Mars. When the seven-day planetary system reached Germanic lands, it was natural for communities to align those days with their own gods. Archaeological evidence supports the antiquity of this practice. Roman altars from late antiquity display carvings of the 7 planetary gods in sequence. Such monuments indicate that the system was well established in the Roman world by the 3rd or 4th century. Its adoption in Germanic regions likely occurred no later than the 4th or 5th century, though the process may not have unfolded uniformly across all territories. Medieval storytellers confidently projected these day names back into legendary antiquity. Chroniclers describing early Anglo-Saxon leaders claimed that the people descended from Woden, whom they regarded as divine, and that a specific weekday was dedicated to him, while another honoured his consort. Other writers elaborated on this theme, portraying pagan ancestors as worshippers of Saturn, Jupiter, and especially Mercury, whom they identified with Woden. These accounts blend classical mythology with native tradition, but they clearly reflect a belief that the weekday names were ancient within the culture itself. Some medieval scholars attempted to analyse the identifications more critically. They observed that Norse Odin and Thor did not correspond neatly to Mercury and Jupiter according to classical genealogies. Thor was the son of Odin, whereas in Roman mythology Jupiter was father of Mercury. This mismatch suggested that the equivalence between gods was symbolic, rather than literal. The Roman names served as interpretive bridges, not exact theological parallels. Despite such inconsistencies, the association between weekday names and Germanic gods was widely accepted as a relic of pagan antiquity. The variation of weekday names among different Germanic groups further reinforces their early origin. In some regions, older divine names survived longer, while in others, abstract or numerical forms replaced them. For example, certain communities preserved the name linked to Woden for Wednesday, whereas others eventually adopted a term meaning midweek. This divergence cannot easily be explained as a Christian innovation. Once the original pagan deity had faded from clear memory, it would have been unlikely for church authorities to authorize new paganized forms. Instead, these differences point to regional developments rooted in earlier traditions. Neighbouring peoples offer a revealing contrast. Slavic and Baltic languages did not generally adopt planetary names for the days, instead numbering them in sequence. This pattern does not reflect later conversion, but rather a different path of cultural contact. Where Roman influence penetrated early, planetary naming took hold. Where it arrived later or through different channels, counting systems prevailed. In some Slavic areas, even the order of numbering diverged from the Latin pattern, emphasizing Monday as the first working day after rest, and placing Thursday as the 4th day. Such distinctions highlight independent adaptation, rather than centralized imposition. From these observations, a broader conclusion emerges. When Roman sources refer to Mercury, Jupiter, or Mars in Germanic contexts, the most plausible interpretation is that they are identifying local deities, corresponding to Woden, Dona, and Tu. The weekday system reflects this translation process. It stands as an enduring example of cultural exchange during the centuries when Germanic and Roman religious ideas intersected. Turning to Woden himself, his prominence across Germanic traditions is unmistakable. Under different linguistic forms, his name appears throughout Northern Europe. In Old High German, he is Wotan. Among the Anglo-Saxons, Woden. In Old Norse, Odin. Variations in spelling reflect regional speech, yet the underlying figure remains the same. Even Romance dialects in Alpine regions preserved distorted echoes of his name, long after pagan worship had disappeared. The name itself is linked to words signifying movement, force, and inspired fury. From the same root come terms for passion, poetic ecstasy, and divine frenzy. This double sense, creative inspiration and wild intensity, shaped his character. Over time, Christian writers exploited the darker connotations, recasting him as a raging or demonic presence. Expressions invoking his name survived in popular speech as oaths or exclamations, long after formal devotion had ended. In earlier belief, Woden embodied a far more complex figure. He was imagined as a world-pervading power, a source of wisdom and poetic gift, and above all as a god of battle and victory. Fallen warriors were thought to belong to him. He granted success in war, devised battle formations, and bestowed courage upon fighters. Victory was not merely a matter of strength, but a sign of divine favour. Legends illustrate this role vividly. One tale recounts how rival tribes sought his support before battle. Through clever stratagem and the intervention of his consort, one group secured both a new name and divine backing. The act of naming carried power. Once he had spoken the name, he was bound to grant victory. The story blends myth and tribal memory, yet it underscores the belief that Woden controlled the fortunes of war. Another striking motif portrays him seated upon a high throne in heaven, from which he surveys the entire world. From this vantage point, nothing escapes his sight. The image of a divine observer, enthroned above and gazing over human affairs, became deeply rooted in northern imagination. Even later, folktales echo the idea of a heavenly seat from which all earthly deeds are visible. Such continuity reveals how pre-Christian imagery could persist beneath new religious layers. Yet Woden wasn't only a war leader. He was also associated with the granting of supreme blessings. Medieval German poetry preserves traces of this older belief in the personification of wish. In these texts, wish appears almost as a creative force, shaping beauty, bestowing excellence, and fashioning ideal forms. Poets describe heroes and heroines as fashioned by wish's hand, crowned by wish, perfected by wish's art. Wish rejoices in its creations, curses those it rejects, and measures the standards of excellence. This literary figure may reflect a dim memory of divine generosity once attributed to a god like Woden. The language suggests more than abstract desire. It hints at an active power that moulds and perfects. The parallels with northern traditions are intriguing. Old Norse sources preserve related names and expressions linked to granting favour or desire, though the theme is less fully developed there than in Middle High German poetry. Whether these poetic personifications directly preserve ancient theology cannot be proven with certainty. However, their richness and consistency suggest that they did not arise from mere rhetorical flourish. They echo an earlier worldview in which divine power shaped human destiny, beauty, and fortune. In that older vision, the supreme god stood not only as war leader and watcher from his high seat, but also as the source of inspiration, prosperity, and the highest gifts of life. Old Northern tradition did not forget Woden entirely, even in places where his worship had faded into story and habit. In some of the earliest poetry, another title for him flickers in and out of view, a name that feels less like a personal label and more like a sound rolling across the sky. It is tied to noise, to rumble, to the kind of sweeping roar heard in storms, at daybreak when winds shift, and in the heavy din of battle. That association matters because it points to a very old idea. The god wasn't only imagined as a ruler with plans and judgments, but also as a living force whose presence could be sensed, as motion and impact. Out of that image grew several powerful notions that later generations treated as separate things. Fury that seizes the mind, the perfect wish that names an ideal, and the loud rush that seems to shake the air itself. In one mood he appears generous and gift-giving. In another he is the storm that frightens the world into attention. Northern speech even keeps a word where terror and a divine title sit side by side, as if fear itself could be one of his faces. Seen from that angle, the god begins to look like an air power first, a presence whose approach is heard before it is understood. The rush in the sky at dawn, the thunder of marching feet, the clamour rising from combat, and the imagined stampede of a supernatural host all fit the same silhouette. This is also why the older belief about the afterlife and the battlefield feels so closely tied to him. Many ancient peoples assumed that a good death, especially a brave one, led to a closer company with the divine. Later, religions expressed the same impulse in different language, speaking of going home to God or seeking God after death. Northern storytelling preserved a parallel phrasing of its own. To go to Odin, to be Odin's guest, to visit his hall meant simply to die. That kind of expression reveals a world where death is a passage into the presence of a powerful patron. Over time, however, the tone could reverse. Once the old god was reinterpreted through a hostile lens, what had sounded like a hoped-for welcome could be twisted into a curse. An attempt to hand an enemy over to the dreaded being. The friendly lord of the slain becomes, in later mouths, a frightening name linked with rage, strife, and misfortune. The change is not subtle. It shows how easily a revered figure can be pushed into the role of a demon when a new faith takes over the moral vocabulary of a society. Even so, the old picture never vanished completely. Northern tales describe a supernatural leader driving through the air at the head of a roaring host, a scene that leaves behind the feeling of wind, noise, and dread. The very language used for his hall and his attendants carries the sense of choice and selection, as if the fallen are picked from the battlefield. That idea of choice sits at the heart of the myth. Those who die in combat are not simply lost, they are claimed and gathered. The belief is not just about violence, it is about belonging, membership, a transfer into a powerful fellowship beyond ordinary human life. When the stories turn from ideas to imagery, the northern tradition becomes especially vivid. Odin is portrayed as an old man with one eye, cloaked and concealed, wearing a broad hat that casts a shadow over his face. The missing eye is explained through a harsh bargain. Knowledge, purchased, with a sacrifice that cannot be undone. Later, storytellers loved this detail because it made wisdom look expensive and dangerous. The cloak and hat create another effect. He can move among people without being recognized, appearing suddenly as a stranger at the edge of a farmstead or beside a road, offering counsel or testing the hearts of those he meets. The clothing is not merely poor or plain, it is the costume of a hidden ruler, a traveller whose true identity is always a step ahead of the observer. That same disguise, centuries later, could be interpreted in different ways, either as the god attempting to avoid the gaze of the newly converted, or as a deliberate lowering of the old divinity into a shabby wanderer. Yet the older logic is simpler. A god who watches human life closely is also a god who enters it unseen. some tales sharpen the image further by giving him a dramatic, almost cinematic movement. A favourite motif has him sweeping someone up under his cloak and carrying that person through the air. The passenger, peeking through a hole, realises the horse is stepping over waves, as if sea and sky were the same road. This is not a random flourish. It matches the broader theme of an air god and wave god at once. Master of wind, rider over water, present wherever motion is strongest. His weapon in these stories is not a shepherd's staff, but a spear of uncanny power. It is linked to victory in a very specific way. The spear can be hurled over an enemy host as a kind of sentence. Those beneath it are marked for death, and the one who casts it secures success in battle. In other accounts, the god himself throws or aims over armies, sealing outcomes that no human strategy can fully control. This is the logic of a wargiver. Victory is not portrayed as a clean reward for skill. It is a decision, a gift, and sometimes a trap. Two kinds of animals follow him like living symbols. Wolves move with the fight because they feed where the battlefield leaves its dead. Ravens are even more revealing. They do not merely circle overhead, they perch close to him, imagined as intelligent watchers who bring him what they have seen and heard. The picture is brutal and thoughtful at the same time. The raven is both the scavenger of the slain and the carrier of knowledge. Later, religious storytelling, with its own sacred birds, sometimes drifted into similar imagery. Birds descending at holy moments, hovering near a saint, whispering counsel into a preacher's ear. Those later tales do not need to be direct borrowings to feel like echoes. They show how easily the human imagination returns to the same visual language when it wants to show divine communication. Another set of names and traits pushes Odin toward the water. Certain titles attached to him in northern speech resemble the names later used for water spirits, creatures half feared and half respected. The ambiguity is important because it matches the god's mixed domain. He belongs to the air, yet also to rivers, wells, sea routes, and the wet boundary places where travellers feel most exposed. The old worldview does not divide nature neatly into compartments. A power that rides the gale can also stride across waves. A power that speaks in the crash of battle can also hide in the dark surface of a lake. That broader profile helps explain why he can be imagined as a sender of wind to ships. A fair wind becomes more than a pleasant accident. It is favour. Sailors and travellers do not speak about meteorology. They speak about help. When later medieval poets describe a perfect wind arriving at the right moment, the language of wish and gift slides naturally into place, and the old god's shadow is not far away. He is the one people call on when the world turns hostile, the one imagined as able to open paths that human strength cannot carve. His likeness does not stop there. Other features pull him toward figures like Apollo and Mercury in classical tradition, not because the gods are identical, but because societies often map unfamiliar deities onto familiar roles. A god who sends sickness and can also remove it resembles the archer who spreads plague and also heals. A god who inspires poetry and guards the art of song resembles the patron of music and prophecy. At the same time, a god connected with writing, signs, and secret knowledge resembles the divine inventor, credited with letters and clever skills. Northern myth places runes and hidden wisdom close to Odin, as if the very act of carving meaning into wood or stone were a sacred technique. Medieval moralists later claimed that gambling and dice came from dark sources, and popular stories frequently cast the devil as a card player who lures people into ruin. Yet behind those accusations is an older habit of linking the inventor god with risky games, chance, and the dangerous thrill of fortune. Wherever human life touches fate most sharply, Battle, travel, sickness, inspiration, luck. This god is nearby. The image of a divine wanderer strengthens this connection. Stories repeatedly place him on the road, arriving at night, lodging briefly in poor homes, speaking in riddles, testing generosity, and rewarding those who act with courage or kindness. In later Christian storytelling, similar wandering motifs appear with holy figures. The pattern is older than any one religion. A culture imagines the highest power not only enthroned above, but also walking among ordinary people, close enough to be encountered. A different kind of memory clings to the sky itself. Long before modern astronomy, people looked north and saw a cluster of stars shaped like a wagon. Many languages call it a wagon or a cart, and in parts of northern Europe it was linked with a lordly name. The star wagon becomes, in effect, the vehicle of the highest power moving across the night. Some late medieval traditions preserve forms that point to Wednesday's wagon, which quietly preserves the older association with Woden's day. The idea is not simply poetic decoration. It turns the heavens into a familiar landscape where divine movement can be tracked, where the night itself carries signs that belong to a god's domain. Earthly geography holds even more stubborn traces. Across Germanic lands, hills and mountains carry names that point back to Woden in older forms, sometimes later reshaped into more generic god names, when people no longer wish to speak the pagan title aloud. A hill once sacred to him can survive as a place name, even after temples have vanished. The clustering of such names is not random. These are the sorts of high places where worship, assembly, and oath-making could gather, where a community might feel that the sky was closer and the god more present. Legends then attach themselves to these sites like vines. A mountain becomes a prison for a sleeping king. A hidden army waits inside a hill until a destined day. A miraculous spring is opened for thirsty warriors after victory. Such tales often shift their hero from a pagan god to a later celebrated ruler. But the older framework remains. The mountain is sacred, the host is supernatural, the victory is ordained. The landscape itself is a storehouse of power. Place names do not stop at mountains. Fields, clearings, homesteads, and old boundary points also preserve fragments. Certain names hint that the god was connected not only with war but with measurement and demarcation, marking land, setting limits, guarding borders. That fits the profile of a wandering power who moves along roads and edges, present where humans draw lines and claim ownership. The divine becomes a witness to boundaries, and boundaries become a kind of quiet ritual repeated across generations. The most vivid survival, though, is not a word on a map. It is a habit performed with the hands. In parts of northern Germany, especially where older rural customs endured, harvest time carried a small act of offering that was once directed to Woden's horse. The practice was simple. A tuft of grain would be left standing in the field. It was not an enormous sacrifice, not a dramatic slaughter, not a grand temple rite. It was a practical gesture of gratitude and insurance. The harvesters acknowledged that not everything should be taken for oneself. A portion belonged to the unseen powers that guarded fertility. In northern myth, Odin rides a remarkable steed, described as unmatched among horses. Later, folk memory, stripped of mythic detail, still speaks of a tall white horse associated with a wild rider who passes through the winter night. Old descriptions of harvest customs show how public these moments could be. Reapers would finish the last strip together, raise their scythes, strike the blades in a repeated rhythm, and call out a name that sounds like a worn version of Woden. Drinks would be poured out onto the ground before anyone drank, a brief libation that turned ordinary refreshment into a ritual. Crumbs were scattered. Shouts rose. Then the workers marched home singing. The sense behind it is clear. If the offering is neglected, misfortune may follow in the next year's crops. The community behaves as if the land remembers. The field is treated like a partner that must be respected, not a storehouse to be emptied. Other connected taboos appear around the same season. Certain days are avoided for specific work because the rider is believed to be passing. Spinning might be forbidden during the midwinter stretch, when the wild hunt is most active. Flax should not be disturbed, lest the galloping horse trample the seeds. These rules do not read like theology. They read like a calendar of fear and caution, a way of coordinating community behavior around a story that gives the season a supernatural texture. Local legends attach further details. Fires lit on a hill after harvest. Young men waving hats and shouting the old name into the night. A sense that a heathen mound is still awake beneath the grass. The ritual is almost playful, but it is also a confession that something older has not fully died. Even when the meaning becomes foggy, the shape of the act remains. Fertility in the fields was never the gift of a single god. Even in regions where Woden was honoured as the great power behind victory, inspiration, and the restless sky, farming life often leaned more heavily on other divine figures. Donar, the thunderer, stood closer to the farmer's daily hopes, and beside him stood Earth herself, imagined as a motherly force tied to soil, seed, and the steady return of growth. In some harvest rites, the offering that might be addressed to Woden in one place could be redirected to an earth goddess in another, performed with almost the same gestures and the same fear of neglect. The ritual shape stayed familiar, but the name receiving it could change, and that tells a quiet truth. Rural religion was practical. People honoured whichever power felt most directly linked to rain, ripening, and the survival of the household. A useful way to trace where a god's cult held on the longest is not to search for sermons or grand temples, but to follow names on the land. Place names are stubborn. They often preserve older sacred meanings long after the stories that created them have thinned or shifted. When a town, hill, grove, or meadow carries a god's name, it usually points to a site once treated as special, a place where people believed a divine presence was near. It is possible for a human to share a divine name, but that explanation struggles when the same structures appear again and again across distant regions. Repeated patterns matter. The second parts of these names also repeat in ways that match sacred spaces rather than ordinary family naming. In northern Germany and parts of central Germany, there are roads, hills, woods, and settlements whose older forms clearly include Woden's name. The same kind of naming appears in the Low Countries. In the upper south of Germany, such traces are rarer, which fits the broader pattern of the old cult, fading earlier there. England preserves its own cluster of these names, scattered yet recognisable, as if the memory was stamped into the landscape even after the belief system began to change. But the densest concentration appears farther north, in Scandinavia, and especially in its southern regions. That distribution is not random. It matches the historical reality that pre-Christian religion endured longer and with more public strength in certain zones than in others. If Denmark and parts of Sweden show more Odin-based place names than Norway or inland Sweden, that points to regional difference in which gods were favoured. It suggests that Odin was not equally dominant everywhere, even when he was widely known. Some of the Scandinavian names are especially revealing because they preserve the idea of a sanctuary or holy enclosure. The old northern word for a sacred site survives in place names that pair directly with Odin's name, producing names that effectively mean Odin's holy place. Elsewhere, the name shifts into Odin's Island, Odin's Hall, Odin's Grove, or Odin's Meadow, and then later, centuries softened the forms into shorter, safer-sounding versions. The core idea remains the same. These are not casual labels. They are traces of ritual geography, markers of where worship, vows, gatherings, and offerings likely occurred. This matters for another reason. It can change how certain older German place names are understood. Some names that later readers interpret as Woden's Road may actually preserve an older word meaning Woden's Shrine or Woden's Sanctuary. That distinction is important because it connects the name to worship rather than travel. It also fits something that appears in early Christian writing from the same cultural zone, where the writer contrasts pagan shrines with the vast creation of the Christian God. The polemic only works if the author assumes the audience already knows that Woden had sanctuaries. It is the kind of sideways confirmation that shows how real and familiar those sacred places still were in memory. When these names are gathered together in bulk, their force becomes hard to dismiss. A single village name might be explained away by coincidence. A few might be blamed on family names. But a wide spread of similar compounds across Germany, England, Denmark, and Sweden forms a map of cult and memory. It demonstrates how broadly Odin's worship once reached, even if its intensity varied by region. At the same time, it also exposes an imbalance. The south of Germany kept some abstract traces of wish and fortune in language and legend. Yet Odin himself vanished sooner there. That loss shows up in the landscape too. The south preserved fewer Odin place names, and even the weekday name tied to him did not survive everywhere with the same clarity. If Odin's name appears often in place names, it is striking how little it appears in plant names. The natural world does not preserve him in herbs the way it preserves other figures. Yet one kind of creature does carry his stamp in later northern naming. A small water bird is called by names that associate it directly with Odin. That fits the broader mythic pattern in which birds are tied closely to him as watchers and companions. Even an Old Gloss tradition hints at a similar link, though its forms are murky and hard to treat as fully secure. There is also a curious survival in bodily measurement. In parts of the Low Countries, the span between thumb and forefinger when stretched out was named after Woden. That is not just a quaint phrase, it suggests that the god's presence extended into folk ideas about luck, play, and the body itself. The thumb carried its own layer of superstition and reverence, and lucky people were described as having success run on their thumb, as if fortune itself travelled through that joint. The deeper meaning behind this naming is difficult to prove in detail, but the direction is clear. Odin's shadow reached into everyday gestures, not only into epic stories. Despite all this, it is a mistake to imagine a single, uniform Germanic religion, with Odin permanently on top. He was widely known, and he became the most intellectually charged figure in the surviving material, associated with wisdom, inspiration, battle-death, and the hidden mechanics of fate. That profile helps explain why Roman writers so often identified the leading Germanic god with Mercury. They were matching functions: guidance, knowledge, wandering, signs, luck, and the movement between worlds. But even if Odin was the most universal figure in later reconstruction, the older reality was more local and competitive. Some regions leaned toward the thunderer, others leaned toward fertility gods. In Sweden, later traditions suggest that the cult of Freyja could dominate. In major northern cult centres, ancient reports sometimes place Thor before Odin. That does not mean Odin was absent. It means religious life could be weighted differently, depending on the needs and character of a community. A later northern tradition captures this regional memory in an especially blunt way by assigning different national gods to different peoples. Thor linked with one group, Odin with another, Freyja with another, and so on. That kind of statement should not be treated as a strict historical census. It sounds like a simplified summary, shaped by later storytelling. Yet it still preserves something valuable, the idea that certain gods felt especially close to certain communities, and that those preferences were remembered long after official worship was broken. This helps explain why lists of gods can change order. In some formulas, the Thunderer is named first. In others, Odin leads. Sometimes the order might reflect the arrangement of statues in a sanctuary. Sometimes it reflects what a storyteller thinks sounds most natural. In some narratives, Thor and Odin are named together with Thor first, because Thor represents strength, visible power, and immediate protection. Odin represents a darker and more complex reach. Victory that can betray, wisdom that costs, death that becomes recruitment. A warrior might dedicate himself to Odin while still praying to Thor for protection. A community might drink a ceremonial toast to Odin first, as ruler of slain heroes, then to Thor as defender, then to a fertility god for peace and good seasons. Religion, especially in polytheistic societies, rarely behaves like a single hierarchy carved in stone. Northern myth also complicates Odin's status by multiplying him into sets and reflections. He can appear as the third, not because he is minor, but because he stands within a triad of high figures. Elsewhere, he appears with two brothers who share in creating or governing the world. In different stories, he travels far, disappears for a time, and leaves others to rule in his absence. Those motifs belong to older mythic structures, and they were developed most richly in the north, where the poetry and saga tradition preserved them longest. The point is not that Odin is weakened by these groupings, but that the tradition liked to describe divine power as layered, shifting, and sometimes interchangeable. Language itself supports that overlap. Words for will, choice, and sacredness can lean into each other across Germanic tongues. A figure whose domain includes wish and selection can naturally blur into a figure named will. A god tied to sanctuaries can also be tied to the very idea of holiness. Even the vocabulary of wealth and well-being can take on a near-personal character, as if good fortune were a being that visits or withdraws. These are the kinds of conceptual bridges that allow one god's attributes to slide into another's, or to reappear under different names. One of the strongest proofs of how deeply rooted Odin was, however, lies not in place names or poetic titles, but in royal ancestry. In the old genealogies of Anglo-Saxon dynasties, Odin appears again and again as a central ancestor. Kings and heroes are traced back to him, and the lines often treat his descendants and even his forebears as semi-divine. The family trees mix gods, legendary heroes, and real rulers in a single chain, as if myth and history were parts of one continuous inheritance. That blending is not an accident. It is political religion. Claiming descent from a god gives a ruling house legitimacy, awe, and a story that places it above rival bloodlines. At the same time, the genealogies are not reliable clocks. Counting generations backward to date a god is meaningless. The earliest historically secure kings appear in the early medieval centuries. The mythic layers above them do not belong to the same kind of time. Odin's cult must be far older than the written lists that preserve his name. A striking feature of these genealogies is that Odin sometimes merges with other figures. A name that appears as an ancestor in one list might appear as a divine title in another. A forebear can be treated as a god, and a god can be treated as a heroic forebear. The structure shifts between sources because the tradition was alive, competitive, and frequently edited to suit different kingdoms. Yet through all the variation, Odin remains a key pivot point, suggesting that his role as ancestral source was not an invention of a single scribe, but a widely shared cultural claim. From a wider angle, all of this leads to a larger pattern seen in many polytheistic religions. Even when a culture has many gods, it often drifts toward the idea of a highest power, one figure who can absorb the qualities of others. The lesser gods become specialized expressions, offshoots, or renewed forms of the same underlying force. That does not erase the individuality of those gods in practice, but it does explain why attributes overlap so often and why different regions can elevate different figures to the top. In that sense, Odin can look like Mercury in function and yet rise above that comparison in status. Thor can resemble a northern Jupiter and yet feel more immediate and protective in daily life. A war god may retain the older name of a supreme sky father in one culture while occupying a narrower role in another. These are not contradictions. They are the natural result of myths evolving across languages, borders, and centuries. The northern tradition captures the same idea through its own imagery. Odin is old, deeply knowing, and complex, while Thor is forceful, visible, and direct. Over time, some gods can be interpreted as emanations or younger reflections of another. Under that logic, rivalry becomes family. A thunderer can be imagined as the son or renewed form of an older sky power. Separate offices of the divine can be redistributed as stories change. This is why the same society can praise different gods as highest, depending on context: battle, harvest, kingship, healing, travel, or law. Among the Slavic peoples and several Asiatic communities influenced by Christianity, the role once held by the ancient thunder god gradually passed to the prophet Elijah. In popular belief, Elijah rides across the heavens within the storm itself, borne upward in a fiery chariot drawn by celestial horses. Serbian epic songs speak of him as the true lord of thunder, placing lightning and rolling thunder in his hands. When angered by human wrongdoing, he seals the clouds and withholds rain from the earth. This image mirrors biblical tradition, where Elijah halts the rain and later calls it down again. Medieval German poetry echoes the same belief, portraying him as the one who can shut the heavens and deny rain to the land, bringing hardship upon the people. What is particularly striking is the way Elijah assumes a role almost identical to that of the earlier northern thunder god. In medieval apocalyptic legends describing the final days of the world, Elijah appears as a warrior figure who confronts evil in a dramatic struggle. Norse myth tells of the thunder god defeating the great serpent, yet dying moments later from its venom. In certain medieval poems, Elijah too falls wounded in battle against the forces of evil, and his blood spilling upon the earth ignites mountains in flame. Christian tradition does not originally describe Elijah suffering such a mortal wound. Yet the resemblance to the old mythic pattern is unmistakable. The memory of the pagan thunderer seems to have reshaped the Christian prophet into a similar heroic figure. Beyond Europe, among semi-Christianized peoples of the Caucasus, Elijah continued to be honored explicitly as a thunder deity. The Ossetians believed that a man struck by lightning had been chosen and taken by Elijah himself. Rather than mourning, survivors gathered in celebration, dancing in circles and singing praises to Elijah as Lord of the Rocky Heights. Over the grave they raised a pole draped with the skin of a black goat, an offering made in his honor. Similar customs were recorded among the Circassians, who sacrificed a goat on Elijah's feast day and stretched its hide upon a pole while offering prayers. Even among Muslim communities, prayers against destructive storms sometimes invoked the name of Ilya. Such practices reveal how deeply the ancient thunder cult survived beneath new religious forms. Medieval Europe also preserved rituals connected to rain and storms. In times of drought, processions were organised, clergy and people walking barefoot, dressed in simple garments, appealing to divine mercy. When rain failed to come, it was sometimes believed that the Virgin Mary had been neglected in prayer. Once properly invoked, abundant rainfall followed. Among the Lithuanians, a holy feminine figure was associated with rain as well. In earlier centuries, before Christian saints assumed these roles, petitions for rain were likely directed to the thunder god himself. Although Norse sources emphasize the thunder god's battles against giants, his function as a bringer of fertility and rain must not be overlooked. Classical writers describe him as ruling over thunder, lightning, winds, rain, clear skies, and harvests. The prosperity of fields depended upon his storms. His oak tree provided acorns, his power cleared the air, and his cup was raised in toasts for the flourishing of crops. As son of Earth herself, his connection to agriculture was profound. Thunderstorms were not merely destructive but life-giving. In appearance, the thunder god was imagined with a long, fiery red beard. When angered, he was said to shake it, and thunder rolled across the sky. Even centuries after Christianization, expressions invoking red-haired thunder survived in northern dialects. His beard symbolized lightning's flame, his voice the crash of thunder. Lightning was understood in three aspects: the flash, the sound, and the strike. The flash split open the sky, the thunder roared like a breaking storm, and the bolt descended with crushing force. Popular belief held that the thunderbolt was a dark, wedge-shaped stone hurled from the heavens, burying itself deep in the earth and rising again over the course of years. Such stones were treasured as protective charms against future lightning. Ancient stone axes discovered in burial sites were identified as thunderbolts. The god's hammer, forged by dwarfs, flew through the air with lightning preceding it and thunder following. After striking, it returned to his hand. The hammer consecrated marriages, sanctified runes, and even restored life to bones. Its symbol was traced as a blessing long after the old religion faded. Traces of the thunder god's name remain embedded in place, names across northern Europe. Hills, groves, fields, and bridges bore his mark. Personal names formed from his own endured in Scandinavian lands, while in some regions his name survived only in curses. Over time, as Christianity took hold, the thunder god's image shifted. In some traditions he merged with the devil, inheriting a rough, giant-like character. Stories arose portraying him as gluttonous or foolish, reflecting the transformation of former deities into figures of mockery or fear. Yet beneath these later distortions, the original image remains clear. He was the wielder of the storm, the guardian of fertility, the protector against chaos. His goats drew his chariot across the sky, and when slain and consumed, they rose again to life. Myths of dismembered beings restored to wholeness echo this theme of renewal. Even humble creatures such as beetles and birds carried his associations, believed to foretell storms or attract lightning. Certain plants were planted upon rooftops as protection from his bolts, linking domestic life to cosmic power. Once Germanic communities became familiar with the Roman world and its stories about the gods, a habit formed among educated writers. They started matching the thunder god of the north with Jupiter, the thunderer of Rome. The comparison felt obvious to them. The very name of Thursday carried Jupiter's stamp in Latin, and in early English traditions that same day was tied directly to the thunder god. As these cultures blended, the borrowing went further than a calendar label. Certain well-known Roman sacred ideas were translated into local terms. so that figures and places from Roman religion could be described with the names and imagery of the northern storm deity. At the same time, medieval authors who wrote in Latin sometimes used the name Jupiter while clearly meaning Thor, as if the Roman title had become a convenient mask for a native god. This kind of merging created confusion as well as clarity. Some later claims about the thunder god, such as the idea that he devoured his own children, look like a messy import from Mediterranean myth, where stories about Jupiter and his family were already tangled with older tales about Saturn. In the north, genealogies could be rearranged in surprising ways, and once Roman material was added to the mix, details that never belonged to the original tradition could slip in and harden into facts through repetition. The result was not a clean translation of one religion into another, but a noisy overlap where names, roles, and family trees were constantly being reshuffled. A vivid example of how old beliefs could survive inside new customs appears in a peculiar festival practice once reported at Hildesheim. Each year, around the middle of Lent, a farmer appointed for the task brought heavy logs into a church precinct, along with smaller pointed pieces of wood set up like skittles. Crowds of boys and young men rushed in, hurling stones and striking with sticks to knock the targets down. Others would set them up again, and the pelting would restart again and again, with the scene turning into a kind of public game. Local tradition explained it as a symbolic overthrow of the heathen gods that had supposedly been cast down when the Saxons accepted Christianity. The names of those gods were not always spoken aloud in the retelling, but the figure later called Jupiter seems to have been central to the ritual. Stranger still, a long-standing payment known as Jupiter money lingered in the area. One nearby village reportedly owed an annual sum linked to the same custom, and an additional obligation survived in the form of an odd object delivered each year. A thick, many-sided block of wood, carried in secretly. Schoolboys would dress it up with a cloak and a crown, treat it as a living enemy, pelt it from both sides, and finally burn it. The event could become unruly. Authorities sometimes tried to ban it, and guards were posted to enforce the prohibition. Eventually, the obligation was lifted and the payment was cancelled. People speculated that the village had been punished long ago for clinging too strongly to the old religion during the rise of Christianity, and that the yearly ceremony was the visible scar of that earlier conflict. Even if the details are late and the paperwork survives, mostly from more recent centuries, the shape of the custom feels older than its surviving records. The fixed date in the church calendar hints at a deeper seasonal pattern, because many German regions practice springtime rites, where a figure representing death or misfortune was paraded, mocked, and driven out. In those ceremonies, a puppet was set up only to be attacked and destroyed, almost as if the community needed a public target for contempt. That similarity raises an intriguing thought. Perhaps the wooden Jupiter was not originally a Roman god at all, but a replacement name pasted onto something older. The object might have represented an outlawed power, or even a sacred symbol, turned into a punching bag. Some have wondered whether the skittle shape echoed the divine hammer, reduced to a prop once the god behind it could no longer be openly honoured. Alongside these dramatic public games, quieter traces of the thunder god endured in everyday rules about time. Thursday remained a special day among the people long after official religion had changed. Early medieval prohibitions show that authorities still felt the need to forbid honouring Jupiter's day, meaning the old reverence had not died naturally. Folk practice treated Thursday evening as a boundary. Certain tasks were avoided, especially spinning and chopping wood. In parts of the Baltic world, Thursday could even be considered holier than Sunday. a striking sign of how stubborn the older rhythm remained under a Christian surface. The fear of punishment helped keep such customs alive. Popular belief often warned that breaking the day's rule would bring disaster. As Christian language replaced pagan language, the warning sometimes shifted to a different sacred day, yet the threat stayed the same. Thunder would strike the offender, storms would punish careless hands, and the sky would take revenge for disrespect. That pattern reveals something important. The old thunder god did not survive only as a name. He survived as a sense of danger and power embedded in the week itself. When official documents still demanded, even in the early Middle Ages, that people renounce the thunder god by name, it suggests that his cult had been deep and widespread. The remnants lasted because they were woven into habits that were hard to uproot. The day's taboos, the instinctive oath, the sudden curse spoken in anger, the short prayer when clouds blackened and the wind rose. Compared with the more mysterious and intellectual figure of the high god, the thunderer had a blunt advantage. His force was visible, his presence was heard, his punishment felt immediate. That made him easier to fear, easier to remember, and harder to erase. Across Northern Europe, a simple habit in the calendar preserves the shadow of an ancient god. Tuesday is not just the third day in a modern week. In many old Germanic languages, its name points straight to a figure called Tyr or Tyr. In Scandinavia, the day name keeps the god's identity most clearly, while in early English and Old High German, the word has been worn down by time, leaving only a trace. Even when the spelling changes from region to region, the pattern stays recognizable. Tuesday is the day that once belonged to a war deity. That name, however, opens a much bigger story than a weekday label. Tyr is not just another local spirit in a small pantheon. His name is linked to one of the oldest and widest families of words in Eurasia, words tied to brightness, the open sky, and the day itself. Across ancient languages, related roots point toward the same basic ideas: light above, the sky overhead, and the concept of God. It is the same old pathway that leads from sky and daylight toward divinity. In that sense, Tyr belongs to a deep layer of belief where the God is first imagined as the bright vault itself, and only later becomes a person with a biography. The classical world left the clearest trace of that development. In Greek and Latin, the sky god's name becomes the name of the ruler of the gods. The idea is not merely thunder or storm, but the very authority of heaven. From there, language branches. One branch keeps a specific divine name, tied to the Sky Father. Another branch becomes a general word for a god in the abstract. That split matters, because Tyr seems to stand right at the crossing point, a name that can feel personal and specific in one context and broad and godlike in another. Northern poetry preserves that older breadth in an unexpected way. In Old Norse, there are expressions where Tyr can mean not only one god, but a god in the wider sense, almost like a title. Poets attach it to different divine figures as an honorific, especially when describing battle, fate, and the authority that stands behind victory. In that usage, the word behaves less like a single proper name and more like a powerful label that can be granted to more than one high being. This is one reason the war god story becomes complicated. In later myths, Tyr can be presented as secondary, even as a son within another god's household. Yet his name carries a weight that hints at older status. It is the kind of name that does not begin as a minor character. It belongs to the top of the hierarchy, even if later storytelling rearranges the family tree. The link between Tyr and war is not a late invention. Outside of poetry, early descriptions of Germanic religion often translate native gods into Roman terms. When Roman writers looked for equivalents, they repeatedly reached for Mars when describing the chief war powers of northern peoples. Sometimes, the same culture is described as honouring both Mars and Mercury, which suggests overlapping roles: war on one side, cunning leadership, and the movement of power on the other. The labels can shift because the Roman observer is trying to map unfamiliar gods onto familiar categories. But the repeated appearance of Mars as a leading name is hard to dismiss. It shows that a strong war divinity was seen as central, not peripheral. That matters for Tyre because the war god role in Germanic tradition is never held by just one figure in a simple way. Odin is a master of victory and battle frenzy. Thor is a force of protection and violence against enemies. Yet Tyr stands as a more austere war power, the god who represents combat as law, pledge, and outcome. In some descriptions he is even singled out as the one who governs victory in battle, which is an extraordinary claim in a world where victory is the highest prize. Language provides another set of clues. Names of places across northern and central Europe preserve older, devotional landscapes. Hills, villages, groves, and districts bear the marks of gods in their names long after the temples are gone. Some of these place names are ambiguous because more than one god can be connected to war and authority. But there are clusters that strongly suggest an older link to Tyre's name family. In some regions, Tuesday's name survives in dialect forms that are closer to the old god name than the standardized modern term. The survival is not just linguistic curiosity. It is living evidence that the cult memory stayed strong among ordinary people, not only among poets and clerics. Plants carry that memory too. Folk names for certain flowers and herbs sometimes attach a god's name to a plant associated with power, danger, or protection. When a plant is called by the name of a war god, it is not simply botany. It points to the older habit of reading the landscape as sacred, with specific natural things connected to specific divine forces. In some cases, the same plant can be linked to Thor in one area and to Tyr in another, which reveals something about overlapping roles in the popular imagination. The label follows the function people feel most strongly: protection, war, and the dangerous edge of magic. The most striking evidence of Tyr's importance appears not in place names or plant lore, but in writing itself. The runic alphabet did not treat letters as purely neutral signs. Many runes carried names, and those names were often very old words loaded with meaning. One of the runes, shaped like an arrow or spear, is traditionally tied to Tyr. This is not subtle symbolism. A spear-like sign linked to a war deity suggests that the rune was more than a sound marker. It could act as a sacred emblem, a sign of victory, a stamp of divine authority. Old poetic language reinforces that idea. Tyr's name is connected to glory and honour, and that connection shows up in compounds that intensify meaning, as if the word itself carries a charge. In several traditions, a term related to Tyre becomes a poetic way to say splendour, fame, or triumphant strength. Even when the word is used as an adjective or prefix rather than a standalone name, it still points back toward the god's sphere, victory, renown, and the bright aura that surrounds success in war. Then comes a strange twist. Some rune lists and traditions draw a distinction between two names that seem to refer to the same divine force. Alongside the Tyr rune, there appears another similar sign, sometimes described with a related name that sounds like Ear or Eor. In some alphabets, the two names appear side by side, suggesting two titles, two aspects, or perhaps two regional traditions that later got combined into one system. The split is not just scholarly noise, it lines up with geography. In parts of the German-speaking world, Tuesday is not only Tebu's day in older dialect memory. There are regions where the old day name points instead to that other form, the ear or eor type. This creates a historical boundary in speech. On one side, the Tyre name dominates. On the other, a different war name survives in the weekday itself. That difference is not random. It suggests that the war god was known under more than one name, and those names could function like regional titles for the same power. What does that second name mean? One old poetic explanation connects it to the end of life, describing the moment when flesh cools and earthly joy collapses. In that picture, the word is associated with the burden of death, the shutting down of bonds and pleasures. At first, that seems far from a war god, but the bridge is not difficult to see. War and death are inseparable in ancient imagination. A war deity is not only a patron of courage, he is also the one who takes men, the force that sweeps bodies into the earth. If a name begins as a term for destruction, it can easily become a title for the god who rules the field of slaughter. That angle helps explain why war gods are often surrounded by personified fear and dread in many mythologies. Battle is not only strength, it is terror made visible. Some traditions give those terrors names, almost as if fear itself becomes a companion spirit to the war god. In everyday speech, fear still behaves like a person. It seizes, shakes, strikes, drives people out of their senses. Myth simply pushes that habit further and makes fear into a being. Once the focus shifts from thunder and sky to war and iron, another line of evidence becomes important. The weapon cult. Across the steppe and the forest zones north of the classical world, there are repeated reports of peoples who revered a weapon as the presence of the war god. Sometimes it is a sword raised above the ground. Sometimes it is a blade planted into earth. The pattern is the same. No elaborate temple is needed because the weapon itself is the sacred center. A simple iron object set upright becomes the god's sign and the community's altar. This idea fits the Germanic world more than it first appears. Oaths and pledges are often tied to objects: rings, stones, standards, weapons. A sword held during a vow is not only a tool, it is a witness. In war-centered societies, the weapon becomes the cleanest symbol of authority and fate. It can represent victory. It can represent law. It can represent the divine right of violence. If a god rules war, the weapon is the most natural image of that god's power. Stories that circulate about famous blades follow the same logic. A sword can be treated as a gift of destiny, a sign that someone is chosen to rule or conquer. That is why legends often describe the discovery of a sacred blade in the ground, as if the earth itself yields up the right to power. Once a weapon receives that kind of meaning, it rarely stays a simple object. It becomes dangerous, famous, and sometimes cursed. It passes from hand to hand, with each transfer adding another layer of story. Long after the original cult is gone, the legend keeps the old idea alive. The war god speaks through iron. This weapon-centered tradition also clarifies another old name that appears in Germanic sources. A figure sometimes presented as the companion of the sword, or the one bound to the weapon. In some traditions, that name is treated as a divine ancestor or a high god of a people. It is easy to see how a war deity could become a national founder in later storytelling. People want their origins to come from the highest power they know, and war is often the highest power their world rewards. In that same spirit, tribal names themselves may preserve older, divine vocabulary. If a people's identity is built around the sword, it is possible for the language of weapon and the language of God to braid together. A name that once meant sword can slide toward the name of a sword god, and a sword god can slide toward the title of a people. Over centuries, those links become hard to prove with certainty, but the direction of the thinking is historically plausible. Devotion creates identity. Identity reshapes language, and language preserves devotion after memory fades. All of this sets the stage for the best-known myth about Tyr, the story of the hand lost to the wolf. In northern tradition, Tyr is the god who places a hand into a monster's mouth as a pledge, and loses it when the beast bites down. This is not simply a dramatic injury. It marks Tyr as the god of binding agreements in a world where force is always near. He is willing to guarantee a deal with his body. He accepts permanent loss to secure a necessary outcome. That myth can be read as a statement about war itself. Victory is never distributed evenly. A war god cannot grant success to everyone. To favour one side is to abandon another. In that sense, the one-handed god becomes a symbol of partiality built into fate. He is the divine power of battle outcomes, and battle outcomes always come at a cost. The missing hand is the price of ending chaos and the sign that order in a violent world is never free. Even Tyr's family background in myth carries mixed signals. Sometimes he is tied closely to the ruling gods, placed inside their lineage. Other times his origin leans toward the giant world, with hints that his mother comes from outside the divine community. That kind of double belonging appears again and again in Indo-European myth. The powerful figure who bridges enemy realms, or whose bloodline connects order and chaos. It is another way of saying that war is not purely civilized, or purely monstrous. It stands on the border. Taken together, the evidence builds a coherent picture. A weekday name preserves the god's memory in public speech. Rune tradition preserves the god's sign as a sacred emblem. Place names and plant names preserve the cult's footprint in the landscape. Early observers translate the god as Mars because war is the core function they recognize. Steppe parallels show a weapon made divine, reinforcing the idea that iron itself can become a living symbol of the war power. And myth gives a final, unforgettable image. A god who pays in flesh to bind the world.